Every day, you are controlled, not by chains, but by ideas, by a glance that makes you doubt yourself, by a word that lingers long after it's spoken. You think you choose, but are your choices truly yours? What if control isn't about power at all, but understanding? Understanding the machinery of thought, the rhythm of emotion, the subtle architecture of influence. This is not about manipulation. It's about mastery over yourself and the world that moves around you. This is your invitation into the unseen world, where psychology becomes power and awareness becomes freedom. The morning ritual begins before you're fully awake. Your hand reaches for the phone beside your bed, a movement so automatic you barely register it. The first blue light hits your retinas, and with it, a cascade of carefully curated information floods your consciousness. News alerts, social media notifications, messages from friends and colleagues. Each piece of content has been algorithmically selected to capture your attention, hold it, and shape your emotional state for the day ahead. You believe you're simply checking your phone, but in those first moments of consciousness, you're actually submitting to one of the most sophisticated influence systems ever devised. Every swipe, every tap, every second of attention is monitored, analyzed, and used to refine future attempts to predict and modify your behavior. You think you're consuming information. In reality, you are being consumed by it. This is the illusion of choice in its purest form, the feeling of agency in a system designed to eliminate it. Consider your breakfast selection. You stand before your kitchen cabinets or restaurant menu, weighing options, cereal or eggs, coffee or tea. Each decision feels deliberate, an expression of personal preference shaped by taste, health considerations, perhaps childhood memories. But trace these preferences to their source, and you'll find a complex web of influences, marketing campaigns that embedded associations between certain foods and lifestyle aspirations, cultural programming that defined what constitutes a proper breakfast, neurochemical conditioning created by sugar and caffeine. The neuroscientist Benjamin Libet demonstrated in his famous experiments that brain activity indicating a decision occurs several hundred milliseconds before people report being aware of their intention to act. The feeling of conscious choice is often a story we tell ourselves after our unconscious mind has already decided. We are the audience to our own neural theater, applauding performances we didn't direct. This discovery should be disturbing, but for most people, it remains comfortably abstract. The illusion of choice is too fundamental to our sense of self to abandon easily. We need to believe we're the authors of our own lives, the captains of our own ships. This need makes us vulnerable to those who understand how to exploit it. The master manipulator doesn't eliminate choice. That would be too obvious, too jarring. Instead, they curate the menu of available options. They frame decisions within narratives that feel empowering while leading to predetermined outcomes. They create what researchers call choice architecture, environments where the desired behavior becomes the path of least resistance. Watch how this operates in the realm of consumer psychology. The grocery store layout isn't arbitrary. Essential items like milk and bread are placed at the back of the store, forcing you to walk past thousands of other products. Eye-level shelves contain the highest margin items. Checkout lanes are stocked with impulse purchases designed to exploit the decision fatigue you've accumulated during your shopping trip. Yet you experience this as natural browsing, perhaps even discovering new products you want. The architecture of influence becomes invisible when it's properly designed. Political systems operate through similar mechanisms. Voters feel they're choosing between meaningfully different candidates, but the range of acceptable political discourse is often constrained within narrow parameters. The questions deemed worthy of debate, the problems identified as urgent, the solutions considered viable, all of these emerge from complex processes of agenda setting, controlled by those with disproportionate access to media, funding, and institutional power. The philosopher Noam Chomsky described this as manufacturing consent, the process by which public opinion is shaped to support elite interests while maintaining the appearance of democratic choice. People genuinely believe they've arrived at their political views through independent reasoning, unaware of the sophisticated propaganda systems that have guided their thinking from childhood. Educational institutions play a crucial role in this process. They don't just transmit knowledge, they shape epistemology itself. Students learn not only what to think, but how to think, which questions are worth asking, which methods are legitimate for finding answers, which authorities are credible sources of truth. These cognitive frameworks, once internalized, filter all subsequent information and experience. The hidden curriculum is often more powerful than the explicit one. Students learn to sit still for hours, to compete for grades, to defer to authority, to compartmentalize knowledge into discrete subjects. They absorb subtle lessons about hierarchy, conformity, and the relationship between effort and reward. These lessons shape personality and worldview long after the specific academic content is forgotten. But the illusion of choice operates most powerfully in the realm of identity itself. We experience our personalities as natural expressions of our authentic selves, but psychological research reveals how contextual and malleable identity actually is. The same person can be confident in one setting and insecure in another, cooperative in one group and competitive in another, rational in one frame and emotional in another. Social psychologists have demonstrated that seemingly trivial environmental factors can dramatically alter behavior. People act more aggressively in rooms painted red, more generously when they smell baking bread, more honestly when they see images of eyes watching them. These effects operate below the threshold of conscious awareness, yet they powerfully shape our choices and actions. This malleability of the self creates enormous opportunities for influence. By controlling environmental cues, social contexts, and available narratives, skilled manipulators can evoke different aspects of personality and channel them toward specific ends. The person being influenced experiences this as expressing their true nature rather than being shaped by external forces. Perhaps the most sophisticated form of this influence operates through what psychologists call priming, the activation of particular concepts, emotions, or behavioral tendencies through subtle environmental triggers. A job interview might begin with the interviewer casually mentioning concepts related to leadership and success, priming the candidate to present themselves in ways that align with these themes. A salesperson might start a conversation by discussing trust and reliability, priming the customer to view their subsequent pitch through this frame. The effectiveness of priming reveals how permeable the boundaries of the self really are. We like to imagine our thoughts and feelings as emerging from some stable inner core, but they're constantly being shaped by external influences we're not consciously processing. Understanding the illusion of choice doesn't lead to despair about human agency. It leads to a more sophisticated appreciation of how agency actually works. Real freedom doesn't come from the absence of influence, but from the conscious participation in our own influence processes. When we understand how our thoughts and desires are shaped, we can begin to shape them more deliberately. This is the first principle of mastering psychology for control, recognizing that choice is always constructed, and therefore learning to construct it more skillfully. This applies both to understanding how others influence us and to wielding influence ourselves. The goal isn't to escape the web of influence, that's impossible for social creatures like humans, but to become more conscious and intentional participants in it. The journey towards psychological mastery begins with this uncomfortable recognition. Much of what we experience as our authentic self is actually the product of forces beyond our immediate awareness. But this recognition, disturbing as it may be, is also liberating. Once we see the strings, we can learn to pull them ourselves. Imagine the human mind as a vast metropolis, bustling with activity both visible and hidden. The gleaming skyscrapers of conscious thought tower above a sprawling underground network of automatic processes, emotional currents, and memory storage systems. Most of the city's actual work happens below street level, in the tunnels and substrata that conscious awareness never visits. To understand control, both of ourselves and others, we must map this hidden infrastructure. The conscious mind, that voice inside your head that narrates your experience and makes deliberate decisions, represents perhaps 5% of total mental activity. It's the CEO who takes credit for the corporation's success while remaining largely ignorant of the complex operations that make that success possible. This narrator believes it's in charge, but neuroscience reveals a different reality. Consciousness is more like a press secretary than a president, spinning stories about decisions that have already been made by unconscious processes. Consider what happens when you recognize a friend's face in a crowd. In milliseconds, your visual system processes thousands of features, compares them against stored templates, integrates contextual information, and triggers appropriate emotional and behavioral responses. Your conscious mind simply receives the final report. That's Sarah. The vast computational machinery that generated this recognition remains entirely hidden. This is the paradox of consciousness. The more sophisticated and efficient a mental process becomes, the less aware we are of its operation. When you first learned to drive a car, every action required conscious attention, checking mirrors, adjusting speed, monitoring other vehicles. With experience, these processes became automatic, freeing your conscious mind to focus on other things. You can now drive while having complex conversations, lost in thought, or planning your day. The system works so well you barely notice it working at all. This automation is adaptive. It allows us to navigate complex environments efficiently, but it also creates vulnerabilities, automatic processes, precisely because they operate below conscious awareness, can be triggered and manipulated without our knowledge. The friend who recognizes your emotional patterns and knows exactly how to push your buttons. The advertiser who uses specific colors and shapes to evoke particular feelings. The politician who speaks in ways that bypass rational analysis and appeal directly to tribal identification. All are exploiting the gap between automatic processing and conscious awareness. The emotional system represents perhaps the most powerful and least understood component of mental architecture. Emotions aren't just feelings, they're sophisticated information processing systems that evolved to help our ancestors survive in dangerous environments. Fear mobilizes the body for fight or flight. Anger motivates confrontation with obstacles. Joy signals that current activities should be continued. Disgust protects us from contamination. These systems operate with lightning speed, often triggering physiological responses before the conscious mind has even identified the emotional trigger. But emotions evolved for environments very different from modern society. The same systems that helped our ancestors avoid predators and find mates now respond to abstract threats like social rejection, financial insecurity, or ideological disagreement. A critical email from your boss can trigger the same physiological stress response as a charging lion. Your emotional system doesn't distinguish between physical and psychological threats. It responds to both with the same urgency. This mismatch between evolved emotional systems and modern environments creates endless opportunities for manipulation. Political rhetoric designed to trigger fear, anger, or disgust can bypass rational analysis entirely. Marketing campaigns that associate products with feelings of security, status, or belonging can create powerful purchasing impulses. Social media platforms that provide intermittent reinforcement through likes, comments, and shares can create addictive engagement patterns that feel voluntary but are actually driven by deep neurochemical programming. Memory adds another layer of complexity to mental architecture. We experience memory as a recording system that stores accurate representations of past events, but neuroscience reveals it to be more like an ongoing creative process. Each time we recall a memory, we reconstruct it from scattered fragments, filling in gaps with current expectations and emotional coloring. The memory is then stored again in its modified form, potentially different from its previous version. This reconstructive nature of memory means that influence can be retroactive. By changing how someone thinks about their past experiences, you can alter their sense of identity and their predictions about the future. Therapeutic techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy work partly through this mechanism, helping clients reframe traumatic memories in ways that reduce their emotional impact. Marketing campaigns that create nostalgic associations with brands are attempting something similar, to insert positive emotional memories that never actually occurred. The pattern recognition system represents perhaps the most fundamental aspect of mental architecture. The human brain is essentially a prediction machine, constantly comparing current sensory input with stored patterns to anticipate what will happen next. This allows us to navigate familiar environments efficiently and respond quickly to potential threats or opportunities. But pattern recognition can be hijacked by those who understand its operating principles. When information is presented in familiar formats, using recognized authority signals, following expected narrative structures, appealing to established categories, our pattern matching systems classify it as normal and trustworthy without subjecting it to critical analysis. This is why effective propaganda often wraps new ideas in traditional symbols, why successful products feel both innovative and familiar, why charismatic leaders mirror their audience's speaking patterns and values. The attention system, meanwhile, determines which aspects of the overwhelming sensory environment receive conscious processing. Attention feels like a spotlight under conscious control, but it's actually guided by a complex interplay of unconscious processes. Novelty captures attention, threat captures attention, social signals capture attention, movement, contrast, and emotional significance all have the power to hijack conscious awareness. Understanding attention's operating principles reveals why certain forms of media and communication are so effective. Television, with its rapid cuts and constant visual stimulation, creates what researchers call continuous partial attention, a state where the conscious mind is perpetually engaged but never deeply focused. Social media platforms optimize for engagement by presenting endless streams of bite-sized content designed to trigger attention-capturing emotions like outrage, amusement, or social comparison. The implications extend far beyond media consumption. Any environment designed to capture and hold attention, from casino floors to shopping malls to political rallies, employs sophisticated understanding of how the attention system operates. The goal is to create states of heightened engagement where normal critical thinking is suspended and people become more susceptible to influence. Working memory, the mental workspace where conscious thinking occurs, represents both the most powerful and most limited aspect of mental architecture. It can hold only about 7 pieces of information simultaneously and is easily overwhelmed by complexity or emotional activation. When working memory is overloaded, people rely more heavily on automatic processes and unconscious heuristics. They become more susceptible to social proof, authority influence, and emotional appeals. This vulnerability explains why effective influence often involves creating conditions of cognitive overload. Complex legal documents filled with jargon and fine print, high-pressure sales situations with artificial time constraints, information environments saturated with contradictory claims, all exploit the limitations of working memory to reduce critical thinking capacity. The default mode network, active when we're not focused on any particular task, represents the brain's screensaver, a collection of regions that become active during rest states. This is where mind wandering occurs, where we construct narratives about ourselves and our place in the world, where we simulate future scenarios and replay past events. It's also where much of our self-concept is maintained and updated. Understanding the default mode network reveals why certain influence techniques are so powerful, stories that help people imagine themselves in new roles, meditation practices that alter self-perception, environments that trigger particular kinds of self-reflection, all work partly by influencing the activity of this network. The architecture of the mind, then, is not a single unified system, but a complex ecosystem of interacting processes, each with its own logic and vulnerabilities. Mastering psychology for control requires understanding how these systems work individually and how they interact with each other. It means learning to work with mental architecture as it actually is, rather than as we imagine it to be. This understanding transforms how we approach both self-improvement and interpersonal influence. Instead of trying to overcome unconscious processes through willpower alone, we design environments and experiences that align all levels of mental architecture toward desired outcomes. Instead of relying solely on rational argument, we engage emotional systems, pattern recognition, and attention in service of our goals. The ultimate aim is not to bypass consciousness, but to create harmony between conscious intentions and unconscious processes. When this alignment occurs, change becomes effortless and sustainable. This is the difference between forcing transformation and facilitating it, between temporary compliance and lasting influence. The individual mind, complex as it is, exists within an even more intricate system, the collective consciousness of human society. We are not isolated cognitive units making independent decisions in a vacuum. We are nodes in a vast social network, constantly transmitting and receiving signals that shape our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in ways we rarely recognize. Understanding this social dimension of psychology is crucial to mastering influence, because the most profound forms of control operate not through direct persuasion, but through the manipulation of social reality itself. Consider the morning ritual of checking social media. You scroll through posts from friends, news updates, viral videos, and targeted advertisements. Each piece of content triggers subtle social comparison processes. Who is succeeding? What are people talking about? What opinions are acceptable to express? What lifestyle choices are admirable or contemptible? Without conscious deliberation, you're absorbing information about social norms, status hierarchies, and cultural values. Your sense of what's normal, possible, and desirable is being continuously calibrated against the curated reality presented in your feed. This process exemplifies what psychologists call social proof, the tendency to determine appropriate behavior by observing what others are doing. In ambiguous situations, we look to others for guidance about how to think, feel, and act. This isn't weakness or mindless conformity. It's an adaptive strategy that has enabled human civilization. In most circumstances, following the crowd is indeed the safest bet, but this very adaptation makes us vulnerable to manufactured consensus. The power of social proof becomes apparent when we examine how quickly and dramatically behavior can change when people believe others have changed first. Researchers have found that simply telling hotel guests that most guests in this room reuse their towels significantly increases towel reuse rates. Informing taxpayers that most people in your neighborhood pay their taxes on time improves compliance. These interventions work not through rational argument, but through the implicit message that certain behaviors represent the social norm. This principle scales up to massive social changes. Fashion trends, political movements, technological adoption, even scientific paradigm shifts all depend on cascading processes where individual decisions to change create the appearance of collective change, which then motivates further individual changes. The appearance of change generates actual change, a self-fulfilling prophecy that can be engineered by those who control the channels of information. Modern media systems have weaponized these social proof mechanisms. When news outlets report that everyone is talking about a particular story, they're not merely describing reality, they're creating it. The appearance of widespread interest generates actual widespread interest. Social media platforms amplify this effect by showing trending topics and viral content, creating feedback loops where initial attention generates more attention regardless of the underlying merit or importance of the content. The implications extend beyond individual media consumption to the very fabric of shared reality. In an information environment where different groups consume entirely different streams of news, we get what researchers call false polarization, the perception that society is more divided than it actually is, based on algorithmic amplification of extreme voices rather than genuine popular sentiment. This manufactured division then becomes real division as people adjust their behavior to match their perception of the social landscape. Authority bias adds another powerful dimension to social influence. We're evolutionarily programmed to defer to those we perceive as leaders, experts, or representatives of legitimate institutions. This deference often operates below conscious awareness. A doctor's white coat, a judge's robes, a CEO's expensive suit all carry implicit authority that shapes our response to their words and actions without our realizing it. The tragedy of authority bias in modern society is how easily these symbols can be manipulated. Confidence and competence are often confused. Credentials can be purchased or fabricated. Institutional authority can be claimed by those who have no legitimate basis for it. In our complex, specialized world where genuine expertise is difficult to verify, we often rely on superficial markers of authority that can be easily gamed by those who understand the psychological principles at work. This dynamic explains the success of many fraudsters, cult leaders, and demagogues throughout history. They mastered the performance of authority, the voice patterns, body language, rhetorical techniques, and symbolic displays that trigger automatic deference responses. Their actual knowledge or competence becomes secondary to their ability to project authoritative presence. Perhaps the most sophisticated form of social influence operates through what sociologists call framing, the way issues and choices are presented within broader cultural narratives. The same set of facts can support radically different conclusions depending on how they're contextualized within larger stories about progress, tradition, justice, security, freedom, or responsibility. Media institutions wield enormous power precisely because they control these narrative frames. They don't just report events, they decide which events merit attention, how those events should be interpreted, what questions should be asked about them, and what range of responses should be considered reasonable. This agenda-setting function often operates invisibly, with audiences experiencing the resulting worldview as natural and inevitable, rather than constructed and contingent. Consider how the same economic data can be framed as either robust growth or dangerous inequality, how the same military action can be described as either spreading democracy or imperial aggression, how the same technological development can be portrayed as either liberating innovation or destructive disruption. The choice of frame doesn't just influence how people think about specific issues, it shapes their entire conceptual vocabulary for understanding social and political reality. The rise of digital media has democratized framing power to some extent, allowing individuals and small groups to create and distribute their own narratives, but it has also created new vulnerabilities. Algorithmic curation systems designed to maximize engagement often amplify content that triggers strong emotional responses, regardless of its accuracy or social value. The result is an information environment that rewards polarization and sensationalism over nuance and truth. Within this broader information ecosystem, more targeted forms of influence operate through what psychologists call in-group/out-group dynamics. Our sense of identity is largely constructed through group membership, the communities we belong to, and those we distinguish ourselves from. This tribal psychology, evolved for small-scale societies, becomes dangerous and manipulable in mass societies where group boundaries can be artificially constructed and exploited. Political movements, religious organizations, brands, and subcultures all operate by creating strong in-group identification and clear boundaries with out-groups. Once these tribal identities are established, individual beliefs and behaviors become secondary to group loyalty. People will defend positions they don't fully understand and make sacrifices they can't rationally justify, all in service of maintaining their place within the group and distinguishing themselves from outsiders. This dynamic explains why fact-checking and rational argument are often ineffective at changing minds on politically charged topics. When someone's identity is tied up with a particular belief system, contradictory evidence isn't processed as new information. It's experienced as a personal attack. The natural response is to strengthen rather than weaken commitment to existing beliefs, a phenomenon psychologists call motivated reasoning. Educational institutions play a crucial but often unrecognized role in this social architecture of influence. Schools don't just transmit knowledge, they shape how we think about knowledge itself. The subjects deemed worthy of study, the methods considered legitimate for discovering truth, the authorities recognized as credible sources, all of these create cognitive frameworks that persist long after specific academic content is forgotten. More subtly, educational systems socialize students into particular relationships with authority, particular ways of organizing time and attention, particular definitions of success and failure. Students learn to sit still for hours, to compete for grades, to defer to teachers, to compartmentalize knowledge into discrete subjects. These lessons in what educators call the hidden curriculum often have more lasting impact than the explicit academic content. The social architecture of influence also includes physical and virtual environments designed to shape behavior through subtle environmental cues. Shopping malls use lighting, music, and spatial design to encourage browsing and purchasing. Workplaces use open floor plans and informal gathering spaces to promote collaboration and corporate culture. Social media platforms use color schemes, notification systems, and interface system design to encourage continued engagement. These environmental influences operate through what psychologists call nudging, making desired behaviors easier and undesired behaviors harder, without restricting choice or using explicit incentives. The goal is to structure choice environments so that beneficial decisions become the path of least resistance. Understanding these social dimensions of psychology reveals both opportunities and responsibilities. Those who master social influence can shape collective behavior in profound ways, launching movements, changing cultures, creating new social realities. But this power comes with ethical obligations. The same techniques that can inspire positive social change can equally well spread delusion and destruction. The mirror of society reflects not just our individual psychology, but our collective potential. By understanding how social influence operates, we can become more conscious participants in the ongoing construction of social reality. We can choose which trends to amplify, which authorities to recognize, which frames to adopt. Most importantly, we can learn to see the mirror itself, to recognize the social construction of our own beliefs and preferences. This awareness doesn't free us from social influence. That would be neither possible nor desirable for social creatures like humans, but it does allow us to engage with social influence more consciously and skillfully. We can choose our influences rather than being unconsciously shaped by them, and we can wield our own influence with greater wisdom and responsibility. Deep beneath the surface of rational thought, in the ancient circuits of the limbic brain, two primal forces wage an eternal battle for control of human behavior. Desire pulls us toward imagined pleasures. Fear pushes us away from imagined pains. These are not merely emotions, but fundamental organizing principles that shape how we perceive reality, prioritize options, and channel energy toward action. To master psychology for control, we must understand how these forces operate and how they can be orchestrated to serve specific ends. Desire begins with biology, but quickly transcends it. The basic drives for food, shelter, reproduction, and safety become elaborate architectures of want that extend into every domain of human experience. We desire status, meaning, connection, novelty, security, transcendence. We want to be seen, understood, valued, remembered. We crave experiences that make us feel powerful, beautiful, intelligent, virtuous, special. What makes desire so powerful as a tool of influence is its essential emptiness. Desire is always directed toward something we lack, something that exists in the future or in our imagination rather than in present reality. This gap between current state and desired state creates a psychological tension that motivates action. The skilled influencer doesn't try to satisfy desires, but rather to intensify them, to make the gap between actual and ideal feel more urgent and compelling. Consider how this operates in the realm of consumer psychology. Effective advertising rarely focuses on the objective features of products. Instead, it creates emotional associations between products and desired identities. The car isn't just transportation, it's freedom, success, sophistication. The smartphone isn't just a communication device, it's connection, creativity, cutting-edge innovation. The diet plan isn't just weight loss, it's confidence, attractiveness, self-control. These associations work because they link concrete products to abstract desires that can never be permanently satisfied. You can buy the car, but the feeling of freedom it represents remains elusive. You can acquire the smartphone, but the sense of connection it promises depends on factors far beyond the device itself. You can follow the diet plan, but the confidence it offers is contingent on maintaining results and meeting ever-shifting beauty standards. This is the brilliant cruelty of consumer culture. It promises to fulfill fundamental human desires through material acquisition, knowing that such fulfillment is structurally impossible. Each purchase provides temporary satisfaction followed by renewed longing, creating endless cycles of desire and consumption that benefit merchants far more than consumers. But desire's influence extends far beyond commercial manipulation. Political movements harness collective desires for justice, freedom, security, or national greatness. Religious institutions offer ultimate desires, eternal salvation, perfect love, transcendent meaning. Educational systems appeal to desires for knowledge, achievement, and social mobility. All human institutions, in some sense, are organized around the cultivation and channeling of desire. Fear operates as desire's shadow and complement. Where desire creates movement toward imagined goods, fear creates movement away from imagined harms. Both serve adaptive functions. They motivate us to seek resources and avoid threats, but both can be exploited by those who understand their psychological dynamics. The peculiar characteristic of human fear is its abstraction. While other animals fear immediate physical threats, humans fear possibilities, potentials, and concepts. We fear rejection, failure, meaninglessness, Obsolescence. We fear being seen as foolish, weak, or immoral. We fear loss of control, loss of status, loss of identity. These abstract fears often drive behavior more powerfully than any immediate physical danger. This abstraction makes fear highly susceptible to manipulation because abstract fears deal with possibilities rather than actualities. They can be amplified through imagination and suggestion without requiring real evidence. The skilled fearmonger doesn't need to create actual threats. They simply need to make potential threats feel vivid and immediate. Propaganda throughout history has mastered this principle. Whether promoting war, political ideology, or social conformity, effective propaganda begins by amplifying existing fears and then presenting specific actions as the solution. The enemy is always at the gates, disaster is always imminent, social order is always fragile, but salvation is available to those who support the right leader, embrace the correct ideology, purchase the proper products. This fear-based influence operates across the political spectrum. Progressive movements warn of environmental catastrophe, social inequality, and authoritarian creep. Conservative movements warn of moral decay, economic collapse, and loss of traditional values. Both sides use legitimate concerns to justify increasingly extreme positions and to silence dissent through fear of catastrophic consequences. The genius of fear-based persuasion is that it short-circuits rational analysis. When people feel genuinely threatened, they become less likely to question the proposed solutions or consider alternative approaches. Fear narrows attention, reduces complexity tolerance, and increases reliance on authority figures and group consensus. This is why crisis moments, real or manufactured, create such powerful opportunities for social and political transformation. But motivation is more complex than simple approach and avoidance. Psychologists have identified several key factors that determine whether desires and fears translate into sustained action. Expectancy, the belief that action will actually achieve desired outcomes, is crucial. People won't pursue goals they don't believe they can achieve, regardless of how intensely they want them. This is why effective influence often involves not just identifying what people want, but convincing them that what you're proposing is achievable. Successful movements showcase testimonials and success stories precisely to establish expectancy. Marketing campaigns feature before and after transformations. Political candidates promise that change is possible if enough people participate. Therapeutic interventions focus on building self-efficacy, the belief that one can execute the behaviors necessary to produce desired outcomes. Value, the subjective importance of the desired outcome, provides another crucial component of motivation. The same objective reward can motivate different people to vastly different degrees depending on how much they value it. This value assignment is heavily influenced by social context, personal history, and immediate circumstances. Skilled influencers understand that they can shape value assignments through various techniques. Scarcity increases perceived value. We want what we can't easily have. Social proof suggests value. We want what others want. Authority endorsement signals value. We trust expert recommendations. Personal relevance creates value. We care about things that connect to our identity and immediate circumstances. The fashion industry exemplifies these principles in action. Clothing has minimal objective value beyond basic protection and comfort, yet fashion brands create enormous subjective value through artificial scarcity, limited editions, social proof, celebrity endorsements, authority signals, designer labels, and identity relevance, lifestyle associations. The same piece of fabric can sell for wildly different prices depending on how effectively these psychological value drivers are deployed. Timing adds another crucial dimension to the motivational equation. The same desires and fears that leave someone unmoved in one context can become overwhelming in another. Crisis moments, personal or collective, create heightened receptivity to influence precisely because they intensify both desire for resolution and fear of continued suffering. This temporal dimension explains why major social and political changes often occur during periods of disruption. Economic collapses, natural disasters, wars, and pandemics all create psychological conditions where normal resistance to change breaks down and people become willing to consider radical alternatives. Both beneficial and harmful influences can take root during these windows of heightened receptivity. The skilled practitioner of psychological influence learns to recognize and create these moments of heightened receptivity. This might involve waiting for natural crisis points or creating artificial urgency through time-limited offers, manufactured scarcity, or appeals to immediate action. The goal is to catch people in states where their usual defenses are lowered and their motivation for change is elevated. But perhaps the most sophisticated approach to motivation involves what psychologists call intrinsic versus extrinsic factors. Extrinsic motivation depends on external rewards and punishments, money, status, approval, or the avoidance of pain and penalty. Intrinsic motivation springs from internal sources, curiosity, mastery, purpose, and the inherent satisfaction of the activity itself. While extrinsic motivators can be powerful in the short term, intrinsic motivation tends to be more sustainable and less vulnerable to external manipulation. People who exercise because they enjoy it are more likely to maintain the habit than those who exercise to avoid health problems. Students who learn because they're curious perform better than those who learn to get good grades. Workers who find meaning in their tasks are more productive than those motivated solely by salary. Understanding this distinction reveals why the most effective long-term influence strategies focus on cultivating intrinsic motivation rather than relying solely on external incentives. Instead of bribing or threatening people into compliance, master influencers help people discover personal reasons for wanting to change. They connect proposed actions to the target's existing values, interests, and aspirations. This approach requires deeper understanding of individual psychology and more sophisticated influence skills, but it produces more sustainable results and fewer ethical complications. When people change because they genuinely want to rather than because they feel compelled to, the change is more likely to persist and expand into related areas of life. The ultimate mastery of motivation involves orchestrating all these elements: desire, fear, expectancy, value, timing, and intrinsic meaning into coherent influence strategies that feel natural and beneficial to those being influenced. This orchestration requires both analytical understanding and intuitive sensitivity to the subtle currents of human psychology. The ethical dimension of this knowledge cannot be ignored. The same techniques that can inspire someone to overcome addiction, pursue education, or contribute to social justice can equally well manipulate them into harmful behaviors or exploitative relationships. The power to shape motivation is the power to shape lives, and it must be wielded with profound respect for human dignity and autonomy. As we deepen our exploration of psychological control, the central question becomes not whether to influence motivation, that's inevitable in all human interaction, but how to do so in ways that serve genuine human flourishing rather than narrow self-interest. The answer lies not in moral absolutes, but in the cultivation of wisdom, empathy, and long-term thinking about the consequences of our influence attempts. There comes a moment in every serious study of psychology when the comfortable certainties of everyday consciousness begin to dissolve. It might happen gradually through the accumulation of insights about cognitive biases and social conditioning, or it might arrive suddenly in a flash of recognition that much of what we assumed about our own minds is simply mistaken. This is the birth of awareness, the first glimpse behind the curtain of our own psychological theater. The experience is both exhilarating and disturbing. On one hand, it offers the promise of greater agency and understanding. If we can see the mechanisms that shape thought and behavior, perhaps we can learn to operate them more skillfully. On the other hand, it reveals the extent to which what we've taken for granted as free choice and authentic selfhood may be elaborate constructions shaped by forces beyond our immediate control. The first shock often comes from observing your own mind in action. You begin to notice how your mood shapes your perception of events, how the same conversation feels supportive when you're happy and critical when you're depressed. You start to catch your mind making snap judgments about people within seconds of meeting them, often based on superficial characteristics you didn't consciously process. You observe how your attention gets captured and directed by stimuli you never chose to focus on. The steady stream of consciousness that felt so continuous and coherent reveals itself to be more like a choppy river with hidden currents and unexpected eddies. Thoughts arise unbidden, emotions shift without apparent cause, behaviors emerge that seem to contradict your stated values and conscious intentions. The unified self that narrates your experience starts to feel more like a committee of competing voices with no clear chairperson. This internal awareness naturally extends to the recognition of external influences. You begin to notice how your behavior changes in different social contexts, how you become more competitive around certain colleagues, more deferential around particular authority figures, more generous in some environments, and more selfish in others. The stable personality you thought you possessed reveals itself to be a contextual performance, shifting with the social and physical landscape. This can be deeply unsettling. If your personality is contextual, if your thoughts arise unbidden, if your choices are shaped by unconscious processes, then who exactly are you? What aspect of your experience can be trusted as authentically yours rather than the product of conditioning, manipulation, or neurochemical accident? The study of social psychology adds another layer of disturbing revelation. You start to see how group dynamics shape individual behavior in ways that individuals often don't recognize. The confident public speaker who becomes tongue-tied in intimate conversations, the compassionate friend who becomes cruel in competitive situations, the rational person who becomes emotional when their group identity is threatened. These aren't contradictions, but demonstrations of how contextual and constructed our sense of self really is. Understanding social influence mechanisms makes the broader culture visible in new ways. You begin to notice the psychological techniques embedded in advertising, how products are linked to identity aspirations rather than functional benefits, how scarcity and social proof are manufactured to create urgency, how authority symbols are deployed to bypass critical thinking. What once seemed like natural commercial communication reveals itself as sophisticated behavioral engineering. The media landscape becomes particularly transparent once you understand the psychological principles at work. You recognize how news stories are crafted to maintain attention and trigger emotional responses rather than to inform and educate. You see how social media platforms use variable reward schedules to create addictive engagement patterns, how recommendation algorithms create filter bubbles that reinforce existing beliefs, how trending topics and viral content are often artificial constructions rather than organic expressions of popular interest. Political discourse reveals similar patterns of psychological manipulation. You start to notice how complex issues are reduced to emotionally charged frames that bypass rational analysis. You see how in-group/out-group dynamics are artificially intensified to increase tribal loyalty. You observe how fear and desire are systematically amplified to motivate political behavior that may have little relationship to the underlying problems being addressed. This awareness can easily slip into cynicism and paranoia. When you start seeing influence everywhere, it becomes tempting to view all human interaction as strategic maneuvering rather than genuine connection. Every kindness becomes suspect as potential manipulation. Every emotion feels artificial as a conditioned response. Every belief seems contingent as cultural programming. This paranoid stance is ultimately self-defeating. It cuts you off from the very social bonds that make life meaningful and fulfilling. More importantly, it's based on a false premise that authentic human experience should be free from influence. But humans are fundamentally social creatures. We become ourselves through relationship with others. Influence isn't a corruption of authentic selfhood. It's the process through which selfhood emerges. The challenge is learning to hold two seemingly contradictory perspectives simultaneously, acknowledging the pervasive reality of psychological influence while remaining open to genuine relationship and authentic experience. Not every attempt to change your mind is manipulation. Not every emotional appeal is exploitation. Not every social influence is harmful. The goal is to develop discrimination, the ability to distinguish between influence that serves mutual benefit and influence that serves only the influencer's narrow interests. This requires what philosophers call metacognition, thinking about thinking. You need to develop the capacity to observe your own mental processes in real time, noting when you're being triggered, when your emotions are being manipulated, when your attention is being captured by irrelevant stimuli. This self-monitoring becomes a form of psychological immune system. Just as a healthy physical immune system can distinguish between beneficial bacteria and harmful pathogens, a healthy psychological immune system can distinguish between beneficial influence and harmful manipulation. This doesn't mean rejecting all influence. That would be like trying to live in a sterile environment that kills both good and bad bacteria. Instead, it means developing the capacity to respond more consciously to influence attempts. The birth of awareness also brings ethical responsibilities. Once you understand how psychological influence works, you inevitably become more skilled at wielding it yourself. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to practice techniques of persuasion and social proof. Every relationship offers chances to experiment with different approaches to motivation and behavior change. This knowledge is a form of power, and like all power, it can be used constructively or destructively. The temptation to use psychological insights for purely selfish advantage is always present. Why not manipulate others if you understand how to do so effectively? Why not exploit cognitive biases to get what you want? Why not use emotional triggers to bypass other people's rational defenses? The answer lies not in moral absolutism, but in enlightened self-interest. Systems built on deception and exploitation ultimately become unstable and self-destructive. Relationships based on manipulation eventually collapse when the manipulation is discovered. Communities that operate through fear and manipulation lose the trust and cooperation that make them functional. More positively, sustainable influence requires genuine value creation and mutual benefit. When you help others get what they truly want while also achieving your own goals, you create positive sum outcomes that benefit everyone involved. This approach requires more skill and patience than simple manipulation, but it produces more stable and satisfying results. This realization points toward a more mature approach to psychological influence. Instead of seeing influence as a zero-sum game where one person wins by making another lose, you begin to explore win-win scenarios where influence serves everyone's authentic interests. This requires developing empathy and systems thinking, the ability to see how individual psychology connects to broader social and environmental patterns. The birth of awareness, then, is not an endpoint, but a beginning. It's the moment when serious psychological education becomes possible, when you can start learning to work with the mind, both your own and others, as it actually is, rather than as you imagine it to be. This learning process is never complete. Human psychology is too complex and dynamic for any final mastery. But each level of understanding opens new possibilities for agency, connection, and positive influence. You begin to see how psychological principles can be used to solve problems, build relationships, and create positive change. You start to understand how influence can serve not just individual goals, but collective flourishing. The journey into psychological mastery is ultimately a journey into self-knowledge. And self-knowledge, as philosophers have understood for millennia, is the foundation of all wisdom and effective action. When we understand how our own minds work, we can begin to use them more skillfully. When we understand how other minds work, we can interact with them more effectively and compassionately. The awareness that begins this journey is sometimes uncomfortable, but it's also liberating. Once you see the strings that move the puppet show of ordinary consciousness, you can begin to pull those strings more deliberately. Once you understand the architecture of influence, you can design better influence systems that serve human flourishing rather than exploitation. This is the promise and the responsibility of psychological mastery, to use our understanding of how minds work in service of how minds could work, more consciously, more compassionately, more effectively, in creating the kinds of lives and communities we actually want to inhabit. The birth of awareness marks the end of psychological innocence, but the beginning of psychological agency. From this foundation, we can begin to explore the deeper mysteries of influence, persuasion, and the conscious evolution of human consciousness itself. In the beginning was the Word, not merely sound vibrating through air, but the fundamental technology of human consciousness, the invisible architecture that shapes thought itself. Language is not simply a tool for expressing ideas. It is the medium in which ideas exist, the framework that determines what can be thought, felt, and imagined. To master influence is to master language, for whoever controls the words controls the very boundaries of possibility. Consider the simple act of naming. When European colonizers encountered indigenous peoples, they didn't merely impose new governments or economic systems. They imposed new vocabularies. Native concepts that had no equivalent in European languages simply disappeared from consciousness within a generation. Complex spiritual relationships with land became property ownership. Circular time became linear progress. Collective identity became individual achievement. The colonization of language preceded and enabled all other forms of colonization. This is the first principle of linguistic control. Reality is not discovered through language, but constructed by it. The words available to us don't simply describe our experience. They create the categories within which experience becomes possible. George Orwell understood this when he conceived Newspeak in 1984, a language designed to make certain thoughts literally unthinkable by eliminating the words necessary to express them. Modern influence operates through more subtle but equally powerful linguistic mechanisms. Consider the transformation of torture into enhanced interrogation, civilian casualties into collateral damage, propaganda into public relations. These aren't merely euphemisms, they're cognitive reframings that alter how events are processed and remembered. When language changes, perception changes. When perception changes, reality changes. The neuroscience of language reveals why these effects are so profound. Language doesn't simply overlay meaning onto pre-existing experiences, it shapes the neural patterns through which experience is processed. Speakers of different languages literally see colors differently, experience time differently, conceptualize relationships differently. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, long dismissed as cultural relativism, has found new support in brain imaging studies, showing how linguistic structures alter neural architectures. This linguistic relativity creates enormous opportunities for influence. By introducing new vocabulary or shifting the meanings of existing words, skilled practitioners can alter how their audience thinks about fundamental concepts. The personal development industry exemplifies this technique, transforming problems into challenges, failures into learning opportunities, limitations into growth edges. These aren't merely positive thinking slogans. They're cognitive restructuring tools that change how the brain processes setbacks and difficulties. Political language operates through similar mechanisms, but with more sinister applications. Frank Luntz, the Republican strategist, revolutionized American political discourse by testing how different words trigger different emotional and cognitive responses. Estate tax became death tax, the same policy framed as either affecting only the wealthy or threatening every family. Global warming became climate change, shifting from an urgent crisis requiring immediate action to a gradual process that might be managed over time. These changes weren't accidental but carefully engineered through focus groups and neuroimaging studies. Luntz discovered that certain words trigger automatic emotional responses that bypass rational analysis. Tax relief implies that taxes are an affliction requiring treatment. Energy exploration suggests adventure and discovery rather than environmental destruction. Personal accounts sounds empowering, while privatization sounds threatening, though they describe identical policies. The sophistication of modern linguistic manipulation extends beyond individual word choices to entire conceptual frameworks. Neoliberalism didn't simply impose new economic policies, it introduced new ways of thinking about human nature, social relationships, and the role of government. Market efficiency became the measure of all value. Citizens became consumers. Public goods became inefficiencies. Democracy became market democracy. These linguistic shifts made certain policy options seem natural and inevitable, while others became literally unthinkable. Neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, represents perhaps the most systematic attempt to weaponize language for influence. Developed by studying the linguistic patterns of successful therapists, NLP claims to identify the specific verbal techniques that create psychological change. Practitioners learn to mirror their target speech patterns, use embedded commands that bypass conscious awareness, and employ presuppositions that smuggle assumptions into seemingly neutral statements. While much of NLP's theoretical foundation is questionable, some of its techniques demonstrate genuine effectiveness. Pacing and leading involves initially matching someone's communication style and then gradually shifting it in desired directions. Anchoring links specific words or phrases to emotional states, allowing those states to be triggered through verbal cues. Reframing presents the same information within different conceptual contexts to alter its meaning and emotional impact. The power of these techniques lies not in mystical properties, but in their systematic exploitation of how language interfaces with unconscious processing. Most communication operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. We respond to tone, rhythm, word choice, and metaphorical structure without explicitly analyzing these elements. Skilled linguistic influence works with these unconscious processes rather than against them. Perhaps the most insidious form of linguistic control operates through what Noam Chomsky calls manufactured consent, the process by which acceptable discourse is constrained within narrow parameters while maintaining the illusion of open debate. This doesn't require overt censorship, but rather the subtle management of linguistic frameworks that determine what questions can be asked and what answers can be considered reasonable. Consider how economic discussions in mainstream media operate within strict linguistic boundaries. Policies can be fiscally responsible or fiscally irresponsible, pro-business or anti-business, realistic or idealistic. But these framing categories exclude vast ranges of possible economic arrangements that fall outside the narrow spectrum of acceptable debate. Alternative economic models aren't refuted, they're simply rendered invisible through linguistic exclusion. The digital age has democratized linguistic influence while also intensifying its effects. Social media platforms allow anyone to experiment with viral language patterns, creating new words and shifting meanings at unprecedented speed. Woke, transformed from describing social awareness to becoming a pejorative. Gaslighting expanded from describing a specific form of psychological abuse to encompassing any disagreement. Triggered shifted from clinical trauma terminology to dismissive political rhetoric. These linguistic shifts happen organically, but are often amplified by those who understand their influence potential. Political movements, corporate brands, and social influencers compete to establish new linguistic frameworks that serve their interests. The stakes are enormous because linguistic dominance often translates directly into cultural and political power. Understanding language as a tool of influence reveals both opportunities and responsibilities. Every conversation becomes a chance to practice linguistic techniques, mirroring communication styles, choosing emotionally resonant metaphors, framing issues in advantageous ways. But this knowledge also brings ethical obligations. The power to shape how others think through language is the power to shape how they experience reality itself. The question becomes not whether to use language influentially, that's inevitable in all human communication, but how to use it responsibly. This requires developing sensitivity to the psychological effects of our word choices, awareness of how our framing shapes others' thinking, and commitment to using linguistic power in service of truth and mutual benefit rather than manipulation and exploitation. Language is the fundamental technology of human consciousness. Those who master it gain access to the deepest levels of psychological influence, but with this access comes the responsibility to use it wisely, remembering that the words we choose don't simply describe reality, they create it. Beneath the veneer of rational discourse, hidden from the spotlight of conscious analysis, lies the true engine of human decision-making, emotion. While we like to imagine ourselves as logical creatures who occasionally feel, neuroscience reveals the opposite truth. We are feeling creatures who occasionally think. The emotional brain operates with lightning speed, processing information and triggering responses before the rational mind has even begun its careful deliberations. To master influence is to master emotion, for emotion is the royal road to the unconscious. The primacy of emotion in human psychology reflects our evolutionary heritage. Our ancestors needed to respond to threats and opportunities instantly. There was no time for careful analysis when a predator emerged from the bushes or a potential mate appeared at the watering hole. Those who hesitated while weighing pros and cons became evolutionary dead ends. We are the descendants of quick-feeling, fast-acting survivors whose emotional systems were finely tuned for split-second decision-making. This ancient wiring persists in modern brains, where the amygdala can trigger fight or flight responses in milliseconds, while the prefrontal cortex requires several seconds to process the same information. By the time conscious thought arrives on the scene, the emotional system has already made its evaluation, primed the body for action, and begun filtering subsequent information to confirm its initial assessment. Rational analysis becomes less a neutral evaluation of facts than a post hoc justification for decisions already made by emotional processing. Understanding this sequence reveals why traditional approaches to persuasion so often fail. Logical arguments target the rational mind, but if the emotional system has already categorized information as threatening, irrelevant, or boring, those arguments never receive serious consideration. The conscious mind becomes a defense attorney for emotional verdicts rather than an impartial judge weighing evidence. Effective influence works with this emotional primacy rather than against it. Instead of beginning with logic and hoping to eventually engage feeling, skilled influencers start with emotional engagement and then provide rational frameworks that allow the conscious mind to justify what the emotional mind has already decided. The art lies in triggering desired emotional states so naturally that the target experiences them as spontaneous responses rather than manufactured reactions. Stories represent perhaps the most powerful tool for emotional influence because they bypass the analytical mind's defenses while triggering deep neurological responses. When we hear a story, our brains don't simply process abstract information, they simulate the experiences being described. Mirror neurons fire as if we were performing the actions ourselves. Stress hormones increase during tense moments. Oxytocin releases during scenes of connection and bonding. The boundary between observer and participant dissolves. This neurological mirroring explains why stories can change beliefs and behaviors more effectively than statistics or logical arguments. When someone tells you that poverty affects 37 million Americans, your rational mind processes the number, but your emotional system remains unmoved. When someone tells you the story of a single mother choosing between rent money and medicine for her child, your mirror neurons activate, your stress response engages, and your emotional system generates motivation for action that no statistic could create. Master storytellers understand this principle intuitively. They don't simply relay information, they create emotional journeys that guide audiences through carefully orchestrated sequences of feeling. A skilled political speaker might begin with nostalgic stories that create feelings of warmth and belonging, transition to alarming narratives that generate anxiety and urgency, and conclude with inspiring visions that offer hope and empowerment. The logical content matters less than the emotional trajectory. Corporate marketing has weaponized storytelling with sophisticated understanding of neurological triggers. Nike doesn't sell shoes, it sells stories of athletic triumph over adversity. Apple doesn't sell computers, it sells narratives of creative rebellion against conformity. These companies understand that emotional associations are far more powerful than product features in driving purchasing decisions. The neuroscience behind this effectiveness continues to reveal deeper layers of emotional influence. Researchers have identified specific narrative structures that consistently trigger particular emotional responses across cultures. The hero's journey, with its pattern of departure, trials, transformation, and return, appears to activate reward circuits in ways that create lasting psychological impact. Stories that follow this structure feel more compelling, memorable, and persuasive than those that don't. But emotional influence extends beyond storytelling into more subtle realms of psychological resonance. Skilled practitioners learn to read and mirror the emotional states of their targets, creating what psychologists call emotional contagion, the automatic synchronization of feelings between individuals. Through careful attention to vocal tone, facial expressions, body language, and breathing patterns, an influencer can gradually shift their own emotional state and thereby shift the emotional state of their audience. This mirroring operates below conscious awareness but can be devastatingly effective. When someone feels genuinely understood and resonated with at an emotional level, they become dramatically more receptive to influence. Their psychological defenses lower, their critical thinking diminishes, and their desire to maintain emotional connection overrides other considerations. This is why effective therapists, salespeople, and cult leaders all master the art of emotional mirroring. The manipulation of emotional states can be even more direct. Certain environmental factors reliably trigger specific emotions. Bright lights increase arousal and urgency. Soft music promotes relaxation and trust. Crowded spaces create anxiety and conformity pressure. Isolated settings encourage intimacy and disclosure. Skilled influencers design environments that automatically generate the emotional states most conducive to their goals. Religious and political rallies exemplify this environmental emotion engineering. Large crowds create feelings of belonging and shared purpose. Rhythmic chanting and music synchronize nervous systems and reduce individual resistance. Dramatic lighting and staging heighten emotional arousal. Call and response patterns create active participation that increases psychological commitment. These techniques transform individual attendees into a collective emotional entity more susceptible to influence than any individual would be alone. The dark side of emotional influence becomes apparent when we examine how trauma responses can be deliberately triggered and exploited. Abusive relationships often involve cycles where periods of kindness create emotional bonding that makes subsequent abuse more tolerable. Cults use love bombing, followed by criticism and isolation, to create psychological dependency. Political movements exploit collective traumas to generate support for extreme measures. These manipulative techniques work because they hijack natural emotional processes that evolved for beneficial purposes. Trauma bonding originally helped groups survive collective threats. Emotional contagion facilitated cooperation and group cohesion. Mirror neuron responses enabled empathy and social learning. The same mechanisms that make us capable of love, art, and social cooperation also make us vulnerable to emotional exploitation. Understanding emotional influence also reveals why certain forms of media are so psychologically powerful. Television, with its combination of moving images, music, and narrative structure, creates sustained emotional engagement that can alter mood, beliefs, and behavior. Social media platforms optimize for emotional arousal, particularly anger, outrage, and social comparison, because these emotions drive engagement and attention. The smartphone represents perhaps the most sophisticated emotional influence device ever created. Through push notifications, variable reward schedules, social validation mechanisms, and personalized content curation, these devices create ongoing emotional relationships with their users. The resulting patterns of dopamine release, anxiety, and compulsive checking mirror those seen in gambling addiction and substance abuse. Yet emotional influence need not be manipulative or harmful. The same principles that can be used for exploitation can also facilitate healing, education, and positive change. Effective teachers create emotional states of curiosity and engagement that make learning more effective. Skilled therapists use emotional resonance to help clients process trauma and develop healthier patterns. Inspiring leaders generate collective emotions that motivate positive social action. The key distinction lies in whether emotional influence serves mutual benefit or unilateral advantage. When emotional engagement helps people connect with their authentic values and make choices aligned with their long-term well-being, it represents skillful communication rather than manipulation. When it exploits emotional vulnerabilities to serve only the influencer's interests, it crosses ethical boundaries into abuse. Mastering emotional influence requires developing both technical skills and ethical sensitivity. This means learning to read emotional states accurately, understanding how different triggers affect different people, and practicing the art of emotional resonance and mirroring. But it also means cultivating empathy, respecting others' emotional autonomy, and using these powerful techniques in service of genuine human flourishing. The ultimate goal is not to bypass emotion in favor of pure rationality. That's neither possible nor desirable. Instead, it's to work with emotion more consciously and skillfully, understanding how feeling and thinking interact to create the full spectrum of human experience. When we can engage both heart and mind, both emotion and logic, we create opportunities for influence that is both effective and ethical. Emotion is the language of the unconscious, the gateway to motivation, the foundation of human connection. Those who learn to speak this language fluently gain access to the deepest levels of psychological influence. But with this access comes the responsibility to use it wisely, always remembering that emotions are not obstacles to overcome, but aspects of human nature to honor and engage with respect. In the labyrinthine world of human psychology, certain patterns emerge with mathematical precision. Across cultures, languages, and historical periods, specific triggers consistently bypass rational analysis and compel behavioral change. These are not accidents of human nature, but evolutionary adaptations that once ensured survival and now, in our complex modern world, create systematic vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those who understand their mechanisms. Robert Cialdini's seminal work identified 6 fundamental principles of influence that operate as psychological shortcuts in human decision-making: reciprocity, commitment and consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity. But to truly master these principles, we must understand them not merely as persuasion techniques, but as windows into the deepest structures of human psychology, and as tools that can be wielded for liberation or manipulation, depending on the wisdom and ethics of their application. Reciprocity operates as perhaps the most fundamental social instinct. When someone provides us with something of value, a gift, a favor, information, even a compliment, we experience psychological pressure to reciprocate. This pressure exists because reciprocal altruism was essential for human survival. Those who could engage in mutual aid thrived, those who could not perish. The feeling of indebtedness that follows receiving benefits is not social conditioning, but biological programming. Skilled influencers exploit this programming by creating artificial debts: the free sample at the grocery store, the complimentary consultation with the financial advisor, the politician who remembers your name and asks about your family, all create psychological obligations that extend far beyond the value of what was actually provided. The target feels compelled to reciprocate, not because the initial gift was particularly valuable, but because refusing reciprocity violates deep psychological imperatives. The principle extends beyond material exchanges into more subtle realms. Information reciprocity creates obligation through knowledge sharing. Emotional reciprocity builds bonds through vulnerability and disclosure. Even conceptual reciprocity operates when someone shares ideas or perspectives that expand understanding. Master manipulators understand that the most powerful debts are often intangible. The gift of feeling heard, understood, or valued creates obligations that can be called upon indefinitely. Commitment and consistency exploits our psychological need to appear rational and stable to ourselves and others. Once we take a position, especially if we've expressed it publicly or invested effort in reaching it, we experience powerful pressure to maintain that position even when evidence suggests we should change course. This consistency drive helped our ancestors maintain beneficial alliances and strategies, but in modern contexts, it can trap us in disadvantageous commitments. The psychology of escalating commitment reveals how this principle can be weaponized. The foot in the door technique begins with small requests that establish identity categories. I'm someone who supports environmental causes, and then leverages those categories to secure larger commitments. The sunk cost fallacy keeps people invested in failing ventures because abandoning them would mean admitting error. Public commitments become psychological prisons because changing course would require acknowledging that our previous decisions were mistaken. Cults and totalitarian movements excel at exploiting consistency drives. They begin with small ideological commitments and gradually escalate demands while making abandonment increasingly costly. Each step seems reasonable given the previous step, creating chains of commitment that become stronger over time. The target doesn't notice the gradual erosion of freedom because each new demand feels consistent with previous choices. Social proof leverages our deep dependence on collective wisdom for navigation in uncertain environments. When situations are ambiguous and stakes are high, we look to others for guidance about appropriate behavior. This heuristic served our ancestors well. Following the crowd was usually safer than striking out alone. But in mass society, social proof can be manufactured and manipulated by those who control information channels. The principle operates most powerfully when the social proof comes from similar others. Testimonials from people just like you carry more weight than celebrity endorsements. Statistics about behavior in your neighborhood affect you more than national averages. This similarity principle explains why effective propaganda often features ordinary people rather than obvious authorities. The message seems more credible when it comes from peers rather than elites. Digital media has weaponized social proof through metrics like likes, shares, comments, and trending topics. These signals create artificial consensus that influences both individual behavior and algorithmic amplification. The appearance of popularity generates actual popularity in self-reinforcing cycles that can be initiated by relatively small investments in fake engagement. Authority exploits our evolved tendency to defer to those with greater knowledge, power, or status. This deference was adaptive when authority figures actually possessed superior expertise relevant to survival challenges. But in complex modern societies, authority symbols can be easily manipulated or divorced from actual competence. The principle operates through symbols rather than substance. White coats suggest medical expertise regardless of actual qualifications. Expensive suits imply business acumen independent of track record. Academic titles carry weight even outside areas of specialization. These symbols trigger automatic deference responses that bypass critical evaluation of actual competence. Manufactured authority has become increasingly sophisticated. Think tanks create expert opinions on demand. Social media influencers build authority through follower counts rather than expertise. Corporate spokespeople are selected for credibility markers rather than knowledge. The symbols of authority proliferate, while actual authority becomes increasingly difficult to verify. Liking influences us to comply with requests from people we find attractive, similar, familiar, or associated with positive experiences. This principle reflects the evolutionary advantage of cooperating with tribe members while maintaining suspicion of outsiders. But modern influence techniques can artificially create the psychological conditions that trigger liking responses. Similarity can be manufactured through mirroring techniques, matching speech patterns, values expressions, lifestyle choices, and even physical postures. Attractiveness can be enhanced through grooming, styling, and environmental design. Familiarity can be built through repeated exposure and personal disclosure. Association with positive experiences can be created through timing, setting, and emotional state management. Sales training programs systematically teach these liking enhancement techniques. Political candidates are coached to mirror their audience's demographics and values. Corporate representatives are selected and trained to maximize likability within target markets. The goal is to create artificial intimacy that generates compliance without the target recognizing the manipulation. Scarcity triggers urgency by suggesting that valuable opportunities are limited in availability or time. This principle evolved because many survival-relevant resources were indeed scarce: food, mates, territory, protection. Those who could act quickly when opportunities arose had survival advantages over those who hesitated. But artificial scarcity can trigger the same psychological responses as genuine scarcity. limited time offers, exclusive memberships, and countdown timers all exploit scarcity psychology. The fear of missing out, FOMO, creates urgency that bypasses careful consideration. Even information can be made scarce through exclusive access, insider knowledge, or secret revelations. The psychology of scarcity operates independently of actual value. We want things more when we believe we can't have them. Understanding these principles reveals the architecture underlying most persuasion attempts. Effective influence campaigns typically combine multiple principles in carefully orchestrated sequences. A political movement might begin with authority, expert endorsements, add social proof, polling data, create reciprocity, policy benefits, exploit liking, relatable candidates, demand consistency, public commitments, and finish with scarcity, urgent threats requiring immediate action. But recognizing these patterns also reveals their ethical dimensions. The same principles that can manipulate people into harmful decisions can also guide them toward beneficial ones. A public health campaign encouraging vaccination uses identical psychological mechanisms to a conspiracy theory promoting dangerous treatments. The techniques themselves are morally neutral. Their ethics depend entirely on their application. This recognition leads to what we might call ethical influence, the conscious use of psychological principles in service of others' authentic interests rather than purely selfish goals. Ethical influencers help people make decisions they would make if they had perfect information and unlimited time for consideration. They use psychological shortcuts to guide people toward choices that serve their genuine well-being rather than exploiting those shortcuts for unilateral advantage. The persuader's blueprint, then, is not simply a toolkit for manipulation, but a map of human psychological architecture. Understanding how these principles operate allows us to recognize when they're being used against us and to employ them more consciously in our own communications. The goal is not to eliminate influence, that's impossible in social creatures, but to make influence more transparent, ethical, and aligned with authentic human flourishing. Mastery of these principles requires both technical skill and moral wisdom. We must learn to recognize reciprocity, consistency, social proof, authority, liking, and scarcity in action. But we must also develop the judgment to distinguish between influence that serves mutual benefit and manipulation that serves only the influencer's narrow interests. The blueprint exists. The techniques are known. The question that remains is how we choose to use them as tools for exploitation or instruments of liberation, as weapons of manipulation or methods of mutual empowerment. The choice is ours, but the responsibility is profound. For in learning to influence others, we inevitably shape the kind of world we create together. Reality is not what happens. It's what appears to happen. In the grand theater of human experience, perception trumps truth, narrative conquers fact, and the story that feels most compelling becomes more powerful than the one that happens to be accurate. This is not a flaw in human psychology, but a feature, an adaptation that allowed our ancestors to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information. But in our media-saturated age, this gap between appearance and reality has become a vast playground for those who understand how to manipulate perception itself. The game of perception operates on a simple but profound principle. Humans do not respond to events themselves, but to their interpretation of events, and those interpretations can be shaped, guided, and controlled by those who understand the mechanics of meaning-making. This is why the same economic data can be framed as either robust growth or dangerous inequality, why identical military actions can be described as either liberation or occupation, why the same behavior can be seen as either decisive leadership or dangerous authoritarianism. Political communication exemplifies this principle in its purest form. Modern political campaigns don't simply present candidates and policies. They construct entire perceptual realities designed to make certain outcomes feel inevitable, certain interpretations seem obvious, and certain emotional responses appear natural. The candidate who understands perception management doesn't need the best policies or the most competent team. They need the most compelling narrative and the most skillful reality construction. Consider how the game operates in contemporary electoral politics. A candidate's policy positions matter far less than the story those positions tell about the candidate's identity, values, and competence. Voters don't analyze economic plans. They respond to confidence, authenticity, and relatability. They don't evaluate foreign policy expertise. They assess whether someone looks presidential or seems like a leader. These assessments happen instantaneously, often before any substantive information is processed, and once formed, they filter all subsequent information to confirm initial impressions. The sophistication of modern perception management extends beyond individual candidates to the construction of entire political realities through careful message coordination across multiple channels, news media, social media, advertising, and surrogates. Skilled political operatives can create the appearance of widespread consensus around particular interpretations of events. When the same talking points appear simultaneously across dozens of outlets, audiences experience this as independent validation rather than coordinated messaging. This orchestration of consensus extends to the manufacturing of grassroots movements. Astroturfing, the creation of artificial grassroots support, uses perception management to make corporate or political interests appear as authentic popular sentiment. Through social media manipulation, sock puppet accounts, and coordinated posting, relatively small groups can create the impression of massive public support or opposition for particular policies or candidates. The digital age has democratized perception management while also making it more powerful and less detectable. Anyone can now create sophisticated-looking websites, viral content, and social media campaigns that rival those produced by major corporations or government agencies. The barriers to entry for reality construction have collapsed, creating an environment where competing versions of truth battle for audience attention and psychological allegiance. Deepfakes and other synthetic media represent the cutting edge of perception manipulation, allowing the creation of convincing audio and video content that documents events that never occurred. But even without such advanced technology, perception management operates through more subtle but equally effective techniques: selective editing, strategic timing, emotional framing, and context-beating text manipulation. The news media serves as both arena and weapon in the game of perception. Understanding this reveals why media literacy focuses not just on identifying false information, but on recognizing how true information can be presented in ways that create false impressions. A statistic taken out of context, a quote edited for emotional impact, a story timed to coincide with other events, all can create perceptions that are technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. Television, in particular, excels at perception management because it combines visual information, emotional music, narrative structure, and parasocial relationships in ways that bypass critical analysis. The nightly news doesn't simply inform, it creates emotional experiences that shape how viewers feel about the world. Crime stories make neighborhoods seem more dangerous than statistics warrant. Economic reporting can make prosperity feel precarious or poverty seem inevitable. Weather coverage transforms natural variations into dramatic narratives of crisis and resolution. Corporate perception management operates through similar mechanisms, but with commercial rather than political goals. Brand management is fundamentally about controlling how consumers perceive products, companies, and categories. Nike doesn't sell athletic shoes. It sells the perception of athletic excellence and personal empowerment. Apple doesn't sell computers. It sells the perception of creative rebellion and technological sophistication. The techniques of corporate perception management have become increasingly sophisticated as companies recognize that perception often matters more than reality in determining business success. Corporate social responsibility campaigns can make environmentally destructive companies appear green. Diversity initiatives can make discriminatory organizations seem progressive. Customer service scripts can make exploitative companies appear caring and responsive. Social media platforms represent perhaps the most powerful perception management tools ever created because they allow for real-time, personalized reality construction. Through algorithmic curation, these platforms can show different users entirely different versions of reality while making each version seem comprehensive and accurate. Political polarization, social fragmentation, and the collapse of shared truth can all be traced partly to the way these platforms optimize for engagement rather than accuracy. The psychology underlying perception management exploits several cognitive biases that operate below conscious awareness. The availability heuristic makes recent, vivid, or emotional information seem more important than it actually is. Confirmation bias leads people to accept information that confirms existing beliefs while rejecting contradictory evidence. The halo effect causes positive impressions in one area to influence perceptions in unrelated areas. But perhaps the most powerful tool in perception management is the exploitation of emotional states. When people are afraid, angry, excited, or hopeful, their critical thinking capacity diminishes and their susceptibility to influence increases. Skilled perception managers don't simply present information, they create emotional context that makes certain interpretations feel inevitable. This emotional manipulation can be surprisingly subtle. The timing of announcements, the visual staging of events, the selection of background music, the choice of interview settings, all influence how information is received and processed. A politician announcing economic policies in a factory appears more credible than one speaking from a boardroom. A CEO discussing layoffs while surrounded by employees creates different perceptions than one speaking from an empty office. The game of perception also operates through the management of attention itself. In information-rich environments, the ability to direct attention becomes more valuable than the ability to create content. Those who control what people notice control what they think about, and what people think about shapes their perception of reality itself. This attention management explains why effective perception campaigns often involve distraction as much as persuasion. By flooding information channels with certain types of content, perception managers can make other information invisible through sheer volume. Important stories can be buried under avalanches of trivial content. Complex issues can be reduced to simple emotional triggers that preclude deeper analysis. Understanding the game of perception reveals both its power and its vulnerabilities. Those who master perception management can shape public opinion, influence consumer behavior, and guide political outcomes with remarkable precision. But those who understand how the game works can also develop resistance to manipulation and create more authentic forms of communication. The ultimate question is not whether perception can be managed. That's inevitable in a world of competing narratives and limited attention. The question is whether perception management serves authentic communication and genuine understanding, or merely exploits psychological vulnerabilities for narrow advantage. The game of perception is always being played, whether we're conscious participants or unconscious pawns. The choice is whether to remain naive about its operations or to develop the skills and awareness necessary to play it more consciously and ethically. In a world where perception increasingly shapes reality, this may be one of the most important choices we face. There comes a moment in every student of influence when the intoxicating power of psychological mastery collides with a troubling recognition. To truly understand how to control others is to discover how little control you actually have over yourself. The puppeteer's dilemma emerges from this collision, the realization that the very techniques that grant power over others simultaneously reveal the extent to which you too are controlled by forces beyond your immediate awareness. This is not merely an intellectual puzzle, but an existential crisis that strikes at the heart of identity, morality, and meaning. When you can see the strings that move others, you inevitably begin to see the strings that move you. When you understand how easily beliefs can be implanted and behaviors can be shaped, you question the authenticity of your own convictions and choices. When you recognize how vulnerable the human mind is to manipulation, you confront the uncomfortable possibility that your own mind has been manipulated in ways you haven't yet detected. The psychological burden begins subtly. Armed with knowledge of cognitive biases, social proof mechanisms, and emotional triggers, you start noticing these patterns everywhere. Every advertisement becomes transparent in its manipulation. Every political speech reveals its psychological techniques. Every social interaction exposes the influence attempts operating beneath the surface of normal conversation. The world transforms from a stage where natural human behavior unfolds to a theater where psychological puppetry is constantly being performed. This heightened awareness brings with it a form of existential loneliness. When you can see the mechanisms behind most human interactions, genuine connection becomes more difficult to find and trust. How do you know when someone likes you authentically versus when they're employing liking enhancement techniques? How do you distinguish between genuine authority and manufactured credibility? How do you separate organic social movements from astroturfed campaigns designed to simulate grassroots support? The isolation deepens when you recognize your own capacity for manipulation. Every conversation becomes an opportunity to practice influence techniques. Every relationship offers chances to experiment with different approaches to persuasion and behavior change. The knowledge that you could manipulate others creates a constant temptation to do so, while simultaneously making you question whether your own seemingly noble intentions are actually rationalizations for the exercise of power. This psychological burden is compounded by what researchers call moral injury, the damage that occurs when we violate our own ethical standards. The tools of influence are morally neutral, but their application inevitably involves ethical choices. When we use psychological techniques to serve our own interests at others' expense, we damage something essential in ourselves even when we achieve our immediate goals. Consider the salesperson who uses scarcity psychology to pressure customers into purchases they can't afford. The technique works, sales increase, commissions accumulate, professional success follows, but each successful manipulation creates a small wound in the salesperson's sense of integrity. Over time, these wounds accumulate into a deeper cynicism about human nature and a growing disconnection from authentic values. The same dynamic operates in political campaign workers who craft messages designed to trigger fear and tribal animosity, in marketers who exploit insecurities to sell unnecessary products, in managers who use psychological pressure to extract unpaid labor from employees. The immediate effectiveness of these techniques creates positive reinforcement that encourages continued use even as the long-term psychological costs mount. But the puppeteer's dilemma extends beyond questions of personal ethics to fundamental concerns about the nature of free will and authentic choice. If human behavior can be predicted and controlled through psychological techniques, what does this mean for concepts like personal responsibility, moral accountability, and individual autonomy? If our choices are shaped by influences we don't recognize, are they truly our choices at all? This philosophical vertigo can lead to several different responses, each with its own psychological and ethical implications. Some embrace a form of nihilistic determinism, concluding that since free will is largely illusory, there are no meaningful ethical constraints on manipulation. If everyone is being controlled anyway, why not join the controllers rather than remain among the controlled? Others retreat into psychological defensiveness, developing elaborate personal frameworks designed to protect against manipulation while justifying their own influence attempts. They become psychological libertarians who see all social interaction as a form of warfare where the most skilled manipulators rightfully dominate the naive and unprepared. Still others fall into paralysis, becoming so concerned about ethical purity that they withdraw from social influence entirely. They attempt to avoid manipulating others while simultaneously trying to protect themselves from manipulation, creating a kind of social isolation that ultimately serves no one's interests. But there is a fourth response that transcends these limitations while integrating the hard-won insights of psychological mastery. This involves what we might call conscious influence, the practice of using psychological understanding in service of authentic mutual benefit rather than unilateral advantage. Conscious influence begins with rigorous self-examination. Before attempting to influence others, we must understand our own motivations, biases, and psychological blind spots. This requires developing the capacity to observe our own influence attempts with the same analytical clarity we bring to studying others. We must become aware of when we're rationalizing self-interest as altruism, when we're using psychological techniques unconsciously, and when we're allowing our own conditioning to drive our behavior. This self-awareness extends to recognizing the influences that have shaped our own development. What marketing messages have influenced our consumer preferences? What political narratives have shaped our ideological commitments? What social pressures have guided our career choices and relationship patterns? Only by understanding how we have been influenced can we begin to influence others more consciously and ethically. Conscious influence also requires developing genuine empathy, not just the technical ability to read and mirror others' emotional states, but authentic concern for their well-being and autonomy. This means using psychological techniques to help people make decisions they would make if they had perfect information and unlimited time for consideration, rather than exploiting psychological shortcuts for our own advantage. The practice demands what philosophers call moral imagination, the ability to envision the long-term consequences of our influence attempts and to consider how they serve or undermine broader social flourishing. Individual manipulation techniques may be effective in isolation, but their widespread use creates social environments characterized by cynicism, mistrust, and psychological exploitation. Perhaps most importantly, conscious influence involves transparency about our influence attempts when appropriate. This doesn't mean revealing every psychological technique we employ. That would be neither practical nor effective, but it does mean being honest about our goals, acknowledging when we're trying to persuade others, and respecting their right to resist our influence attempts. The puppeteer's dilemma ultimately reveals that psychological mastery without wisdom leads to spiritual poverty. The power to manipulate others is hollow if it comes at the cost of authentic connection, moral integrity, and genuine understanding. The techniques of influence are tools that can serve either liberation or oppression, depending on the consciousness and ethics of those who wield them. The deepest resolution of the dilemma involves recognizing that the ultimate goal of psychological influence should be the development of greater consciousness and autonomy in both ourselves and others. When we use psychological understanding to help people become more aware of how their minds work, more capable of making conscious choices, and more resistant to manipulation, we transform the tools of control into instruments of liberation. This transformation requires ongoing commitment to personal development, ethical reflection, and humble recognition of our own limitations and blind spots. It demands that we hold ourselves accountable to standards higher than mere effectiveness, measuring success not just by our ability to influence others, but by our contribution to genuine human flourishing. The puppeteer's dilemma cannot be solved once and for all, but must be navigated continuously as we develop greater psychological sophistication. Each new level of understanding brings new opportunities for both manipulation and liberation. The choice between them reflects not just our technical skills, but our deepest values and our vision of what human relationships could become when conducted with wisdom, compassion, and authentic respect for each other's autonomy. In the end, the greatest influence comes not from the ability to control others, but from the capacity to inspire them toward greater consciousness, authenticity, and freedom. This is the paradox of true psychological mastery. The more skillfully we can manipulate, the more important it becomes to choose not to. The strings are always there, ready to be pulled. The question is whether we use them to dance or to help others learn to dance themselves. The most fundamental illusion we carry is not about the external world, but about ourselves. We experience our identity as a solid, consistent entity, a continuous I that persists through time, makes decisions, and experiences life. But this sense of unified selfhood is perhaps the most sophisticated fiction ever created by the human mind. Understanding the constructed nature of identity is not just an intellectual exercise, but the gateway to genuine psychological freedom. The narrative self, that voice inside your head that tells the story of who you are, operates like a master storyteller, working with fragmentary memories, selective attention, and creative reconstruction. It weaves together disparate experiences into a coherent tale of personal development, creating the impression of a protagonist who has learned, grown, and evolved through a series of meaningful challenges and triumphs. But neuroscience reveals a more complex reality. The brain that experienced your childhood is not the same brain reading these words. Every cell has been replaced multiple times. The neural patterns that encoded your earliest memories have been reconstructed countless times, each reconstruction influenced by subsequent experiences and current emotional states. The you of 10 years ago exists only as a story told by the you of today. This storytelling process is neither neutral nor objective. The narrative self exhibits a systematic bias toward coherence, meaning, and positive self-regard. It selectively remembers experiences that support current identity claims while forgetting or reframing those that contradict the preferred story. It attributes successes to personal qualities and failures to external circumstances. It constructs a sense of agency and control even in situations dominated by chance and circumstance. These biases serve important psychological functions. The illusion of a continuous, coherent self provides the psychological stability necessary for long-term planning, relationship formation, and moral development. Without some sense of persistent identity, we would lack the foundation for learning from experience or taking responsibility for our actions. But the same mechanisms that create psychological stability can also become psychological prisons. When identity becomes too rigid, it limits our capacity for growth, change, and authentic response to new circumstances. The stories we tell about ourselves determine not only how we interpret the past, but what we believe possible in the future. Consider how professional identity can trap people in unfulfilling careers. The person who identifies as a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher may continue in roles that no longer serve their authentic interests because changing would require abandoning core identity narratives. The psychological investment in these identities becomes so great that the person prefers misery that confirms their story to happiness that would require rewriting it. Social identities operate through similar mechanisms, but with additional layers of group validation and external reinforcement. Political identity, religious identity, cultural identity all provide powerful frameworks for organizing experience and guiding behavior, but they also create psychological pressure to maintain consistency with group norms, even when those norms conflict with individual values or evolving understanding. The deeper truth is that identity is not discovered, but created. We are not uncovering our true self, but continuously constructing a self through the stories we tell, the choices we make, and the experiences we seek. This recognition is simultaneously liberating and terrifying. If identity is constructed, then it can be reconstructed. If the self is a story, then the story can be rewritten. This rewriting process begins with developing what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to step outside current identity narratives and examine them as constructions rather than facts. This requires cultivating what Buddhist psychology calls non-identification, the capacity to observe thoughts, emotions, and behavioral patterns without automatically assuming they define who you are. The practice involves learning to use language differently. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you learn to observe anger is arising. Instead of claiming, "I am depressed," you notice depressive thoughts and feelings are present. Instead of identifying as someone who can't do math or someone who's bad at relationships, you recognize these as temporary stories that can be updated with new evidence and experience. This linguistic shift might seem trivial, but it creates psychological space for change that doesn't exist when we're completely identified with current states and patterns. When anger is something you experience rather than something you are, you gain the possibility of choosing how to respond to it. When depression is a pattern you're experiencing rather than an identity you possess, you create room for the possibility that the pattern can change. The process of identity reconstruction requires what might be called strategic self-authorship, the conscious choice to emphasize certain aspects of your experience while de-emphasizing others in service of becoming who you want to be. This isn't self-deception, but strategic truth-telling. Every life contains enough material to support multiple coherent narratives. The question is which narrative serves your authentic development. For example, the same person could construct their story as someone who has always struggled with relationships, or someone who has learned valuable lessons about intimacy through various experiences. Both narratives could be supported by the same factual history, but they would lead to very different expectations and behaviors going forward. This strategic approach to identity construction draws from cognitive behavioral therapies, recognition that our stories about ourselves shape our emotional states and behavioral patterns, but it goes beyond symptom management to fundamental questions about who we choose to become and how we want to show up in the world. The practice also involves what narrative therapists call unique outcomes, paying attention to experiences that contradict problem-saturated stories about ourselves. If you've identified as someone who gives up easily, noticing instances where you persevered becomes crucial for developing alternative identity narratives. If you've constructed yourself as socially awkward, recognizing moments of social success provides material for a different story. This process of identity reconstruction must be approached with both boldness and humility. Boldness is required to question fundamental assumptions about who you are and what you're capable of becoming. Many of the limitations we experience as fixed aspects of personality are actually learned patterns that can be unlearned through conscious effort and supportive environments. But humility is equally important because identity reconstruction can become another form of self-manipulation if approached with unrealistic expectations or narcissistic grandiosity. The goal isn't to create a perfect self, but to develop a more flexible, authentic, and skillful relationship with the ongoing process of becoming. The deepest insight of identity work is that the self is both real and illusory, real as a functional organizing principle, but illusory as a fixed entity. This paradox points toward what spiritual traditions call ego transcendence, not the elimination of personal identity, but the recognition that identity is a tool rather than a prison. When we understand identity as a construction project rather than an archaeological dig, we gain the freedom to consciously participate in our own becoming. We can choose which stories to emphasize, which patterns to cultivate, and which possibilities to explore. This choice doesn't eliminate the influence of genetics, conditioning, and circumstance, but it does create space for conscious evolution within whatever constraints we face. The ultimate goal of identity work is not to achieve some final, perfect version of yourself, but to develop the capacity for ongoing conscious transformation in response to changing circumstances and evolving understanding. This requires holding identity lightly, seriously enough to provide direction and motivation, but loosely enough to allow for growth, change, and surprise. In this way, understanding the constructed nature of identity becomes a tool for liberation rather than nihilistic dissolution. When we recognize that we are the authors of our own story, we gain both the freedom and the responsibility to write that story consciously, skillfully, and in service of our deepest values and aspirations. The narrative self will continue to operate. It's too fundamental to human psychology to eliminate, but when we understand its mechanisms and learn to work with them consciously, it transforms from an unconscious limitation into a conscious tool for ongoing self-creation and authentic expression. In the ancient practice of alchemy, base metals were transformed into gold through processes that seemed to violate the natural order. Medieval alchemists sought not just material transformation, but spiritual transmutation, the conversion of human suffering into wisdom, lead into gold, darkness into light. Modern psychology has discovered that this metaphorical alchemy is not only possible, but represents one of the most powerful tools for psychological mastery and authentic freedom. Emotional alchemy begins with a radical reframe. Emotions are not things that happen to us, but raw materials that can be consciously transformed into wisdom, strength, and skillful action. This perspective runs counter to both emotional suppression, pretending emotions don't exist, and emotional indulgence, being completely controlled by emotional states. Instead, it offers a third way, conscious engagement with emotional energy as a resource for growth and self-mastery. The foundation of this practice lies in understanding what emotions actually are beneath their subjective experience. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio revealed that emotions are sophisticated information processing systems that evolve to help organisms navigate complex environments. Fear alerts us to potential threats. Anger motivates us to overcome obstacles. Sadness signals loss, requiring adaptation. Joy indicates beneficial conditions worth maintaining. But in modern environments, these ancient systems often misfire. The same fear response that helped our ancestors avoid predators now triggers in response to public speaking, financial stress, or social rejection. The anger that once motivated effective action against immediate threats now simmers in response to traffic jams, political disagreements, or workplace frustrations. These emotional responses, adaptive in their original context, can become sources of suffering when they're unconsciously activated by stimuli that don't actually require fight or flight responses. Emotional alchemy transforms this liability into an asset by learning to work with emotional energy consciously rather than being unconsciously controlled by it. This begins with what mindfulness traditions call bare attention, the capacity to observe emotional states without immediately identifying with them or being compelled to act on them. Consider the transformation of fear. In its raw form, fear creates contraction, avoidance, and paralysis. But fear contains enormous energy. The same physiological arousal that creates anxiety can be transformed into focused attention, heightened awareness, and enhanced performance. Athletes learn to convert pre-competition nervousness into competitive edge. Public speakers transform stage fright into dynamic presence. Entrepreneurs channel fear of failure into motivation for thorough preparation. This transformation doesn't involve suppressing or eliminating fear, but changing your relationship to the energy fear contains. Instead of experiencing fear as a signal that you should avoid challenging situations, you learn to experience it as information that something important is at stake and deserves your full attention and skillful response. The process begins with somatic awareness, learning to feel emotions in the body rather than just thinking about them conceptually. Fear might manifest as tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, or tension in the shoulders. Anger might appear as heat in the face, clenched fists, or constriction in the throat. By paying attention to these physical sensations, you develop the capacity to work with emotional energy directly, rather than getting lost in the stories and mental elaborations that usually accompany strong emotions. Breathing becomes a crucial tool in this alchemical process. Conscious breathing creates space between the initial emotional trigger and your response, allowing for choice where there was previously only automatic reaction. Slow, deep breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which counteracts the fight or flight response and creates conditions for more skillful decision-making. But emotional alchemy goes beyond stress management to genuine transformation of emotional energy into wisdom and effectiveness. This requires what cognitive behavioral therapy calls cognitive reframing, consciously choosing how to interpret emotional experiences in ways that serve growth rather than limitation. Pain, for instance, can be transformed into purpose through reframing processes that find meaning in suffering. This doesn't involve denying the reality of pain or pretending that suffering is inherently beneficial. Instead, it involves asking how current difficulties might serve future growth, what lessons might be embedded in current challenges, and how present struggles might develop capacities that will serve you and others in the future. The Stoic philosophers mastered this process of finding purpose in pain. They understood that external circumstances are largely beyond our control, but our response to those circumstances determines whether we become stronger or weaker, wiser or more foolish, more compassionate or more bitter. This recognition transforms suffering from meaningless affliction into raw material for character development. Viktor Frankl, drawing from his experience in Nazi concentration camps, demonstrated how the search for meaning can transform even the most extreme suffering into a source of psychological strength. His logotherapy shows that humans can endure almost any suffering if they can find purpose in it, while even minor difficulties become unbearable when they seem meaningless. Modern neuroscience supports these ancient insights about emotional transformation. The brain exhibits remarkable plasticity throughout life, constantly forming new neural pathways based on repeated experiences and conscious practices. Regular meditation literally changes brain structure, increasing gray matter in areas associated with emotional regulation and self-awareness, while decreasing activity in the amygdala, which processes fear and anxiety. The practice of emotional alchemy also involves what might be called energy cultivation, learning to generate and maintain emotional states that serve your goals rather than being entirely reactive to external circumstances. This includes developing the capacity to access states like gratitude, compassion, determination, and clarity independently of whether current conditions seem to warrant these states. Gratitude practices, for example, don't just make you feel better. They literally rewire the brain to notice positive aspects of experience that might otherwise be overlooked. Regular gratitude practice increases activity in the prefrontal cortex and decreases activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, creating lasting changes in how you perceive and respond to life circumstances. Similarly, compassion practices develop the capacity to respond to both your own suffering and others' suffering with kindness rather than judgment, resistance, or overwhelm. This doesn't involve becoming passive or accepting harmful behavior, but rather developing the emotional stability and clarity necessary for skillful response to difficult situations. The ultimate goal of emotional alchemy is what might be called emotional sovereignty, the capacity to experience emotions fully without being controlled by them, to use emotional energy skillfully without being depleted by it, and to respond to emotional challenges with wisdom rather than unconscious reactivity. This sovereignty develops through regular practice of emotional awareness, conscious breathing, cognitive reframing, and state cultivation, but it also requires integration with daily life activities, learning to apply these skills in real-world situations where emotions run high and stakes feel significant. The practice inevitably involves working with what psychologists call emotional triggers, situations, people, or experiences that consistently evoke strong emotional reactions. Instead of avoiding these triggers or being controlled by them, emotional alchemy involves consciously engaging with them as opportunities for growth and skill development. This might involve deliberately exposing yourself to manageable levels of discomfort in order to build tolerance and develop more skillful responses. It could mean practicing difficult conversations with people who typically trigger defensiveness or anger. It might involve taking on challenges that evoke fear in order to develop courage and competence. But emotional alchemy must be approached with wisdom and self-compassion. The goal isn't to become invulnerable or emotionally numb, but to develop greater capacity for conscious response to the full spectrum of human emotional experience. This includes honoring the important information that emotions provide while not being enslaved by emotional reactivity. The deepest level of emotional alchemy involves recognizing that emotions are not obstacles to overcome, but aspects of human experience to be integrated and honored. When fear arises, instead of seeing it as a problem to be solved, you can appreciate the care for well-being that fear represents. When anger emerges, instead of suppressing it or being controlled by it, you can access the energy for positive change that anger contains. This integration creates what might be called emotional wisdom, the capacity to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, to care passionately without becoming attached to outcomes, and to respond to life's challenges with both strength and compassion. Emotional alchemy represents perhaps the most practical application of psychological mastery. While understanding how to influence others is valuable, learning to work skillfully with your own emotional energy determines the quality of your daily experience and your capacity for authentic achievement and genuine happiness. The transformation from emotional reactivity to emotional sovereignty is not accomplished once, but represents an ongoing practice of conscious engagement with the raw materials of human experience. Each challenging emotion becomes an opportunity to practice alchemy. Each difficult situation becomes a laboratory for developing greater skill and wisdom. In this way, emotional alchemy transforms the inevitable difficulties of human life from obstacles to be avoided into resources for ongoing growth and self-mastery. The lead of suffering becomes the gold of wisdom, not through magical thinking, but through the systematic application of conscious awareness to the fundamental processes of emotional experience. The human mind operates like a sophisticated computer running programs written by experience, culture, genetics, and countless unconscious influences. Most of these programs run automatically, below the threshold of awareness, generating predictable thoughts, emotions, and behaviors in response to familiar triggers. But unlike a computer, the human mind possesses a remarkable capacity. It can rewrite its own programming. This process of conscious cognitive reprogramming represents perhaps the most powerful tool for psychological liberation and self-mastery. Understanding how mental programming works begins with recognizing that the brain is fundamentally a pattern matching and pattern creating device. Every repeated experience creates neural pathways that make similar future experiences more likely to unfold in similar ways. This is the neurological basis of habit formation, skill development, and automatic behavioral responses. Consider how a simple habit like reaching for your phone when you feel bored becomes deeply embedded. The initial behavior might have been conscious. You deliberately checked your phone to pass time, but repetition creates neurological shortcuts that bypass conscious decision-making. Eventually, the sequence becomes so automatic that you might find yourself scrolling through social media without ever making a conscious choice to do so. This same mechanism operates across all domains of mental activity. Thought patterns become habitual through repetition. Emotional responses become automatic through conditioning. Behavioral sequences become unconscious through practice. These automaticity mechanisms serve important functions. They free up conscious attention for novel situations while ensuring that beneficial patterns continue without effort. But automaticity becomes problematic when unconscious patterns serve outdated purposes or create unwanted outcomes. The anxiety response that once protected you in genuinely dangerous situations might now trigger unnecessarily in safe social environments. The perfectionist standards that once motivated academic achievement might now create paralysis and self-criticism. The defensive strategies that once protected you from emotional harm might now prevent authentic intimacy and connection. Cognitive reprogramming involves consciously identifying these automatic patterns and deliberately creating new ones that better serve your current goals and values. This process draws from multiple psychological approaches: cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based interventions, habit formation research, and neuroplasticity training, but integrates them into a systematic approach to mental self-modification. The first step involves developing what might be called pattern recognition, the ability to catch automatic thoughts, emotions, and behaviors as they arise, rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. This requires cultivating what meditation traditions call metacognitive awareness, consciousness of consciousness itself. Pattern recognition begins with noticing the gap between trigger and response. In most automatic sequences, a stimulus, external event, or internal sensation immediately triggers a predictable response without any conscious choice point. Cognitive reprogramming creates space in this gap, allowing for conscious intervention in previously automatic processes. For example, you might notice that criticism from others automatically triggers defensive thoughts like, "They don't understand me," or "They're being unfair." Recognizing this pattern creates the possibility of choosing different thoughts in response to criticism. Perhaps, "What can I learn from this feedback?" or "How might this person's perspective be valuable, even if I don't initially agree?" The second step involves what behaviorists call pattern interruption, deliberately disrupting automatic sequences before they complete their usual progression. This might involve physical interruption, changing posture or location when unwanted thoughts arise; cognitive interruption, asking specific questions that redirect attention; or emotional interruption, using breathing techniques to shift physiological state. Pattern interruption works because most automatic sequences require completion to strengthen neural pathways. When you consistently interrupt unwanted patterns before they complete, those pathways gradually weaken, while new, consciously chosen patterns have opportunities to develop. The third step involves pattern installation, deliberately practicing new thoughts, emotions, and behaviors until they become as automatic as the old patterns. This requires what researchers call effortful repetition, consciously choosing desired responses enough times that they begin to occur spontaneously. Installing new patterns is more complex than simply deciding to think or behave differently. It requires understanding the neurological conditions that support lasting change. New neural pathways strengthen through repetition, emotional significance, and supportive environmental conditions. Repetition must be consistent and frequent enough to compete with established patterns. This often means practicing new responses multiple times daily over weeks or months. The brain changes slowly and requires substantial evidence that new patterns are worth the metabolic investment required to maintain them. Emotional significance accelerates pattern installation by recruiting the brain's learning and memory systems more fully. Changes motivated by strong, positive, or negative emotions create stronger neural imprints than changes attempted through willpower alone. This explains why transformative experiences often involve intense emotional states. The emotional arousal helps embed new patterns more deeply. Environmental support involves designing external conditions that make desired patterns easier and undesired patterns more difficult. This might involve changing physical environments, social relationships, or daily routines to support new ways of thinking and behaving. The process of cognitive reprogramming can be applied to virtually any aspect of mental functioning. Limiting beliefs about personal capabilities can be replaced with growth-oriented mindsets. Negative self-talk can be transformed into supportive internal dialogue. Reactive emotional patterns can be replaced with conscious response strategies. Automatic behaviors that don't serve your goals can be substituted with actions aligned with your values. Consider reprogramming anxiety responses to social situations. The old pattern might involve social invitation, thoughts of potential embarrassment, physical tension, avoidance behavior, temporary relief, but long-term regret. A new pattern might involve social invitation, thoughts about growth opportunities, breathing exercises, deliberate acceptance, skill development, and expanded comfort zone. Installing this new pattern requires identifying the specific trigger points where intervention is possible, practicing alternative responses consistently, and creating environmental supports that make social engagement easier and avoidance more difficult. The most sophisticated applications of cognitive reprogramming involve what might be called metaprogramming, changing the programs that create other programs. This involves working with core beliefs, identity structures, and unconscious assumptions that generate multiple surface-level patterns. For example, the belief "I'm not good enough" might generate automatic patterns of people-pleasing, perfectionism, social anxiety, and self-criticism. Rather than addressing each surface pattern individually, metaprogramming involves transforming the core belief itself, which then automatically shifts all the patterns that stem from it. This deeper level of reprogramming often requires integration of cognitive work with somatic practices, emotional processing, and sometimes therapeutic support. Core beliefs are usually formed during early developmental periods and maintained by complex psychological and social systems that resist simple cognitive intervention. But the potential for deep change exists because the adult brain retains remarkable plasticity throughout life. Neural pathways continue to form, strengthen, and weaken based on experience and practice. This means that even deeply embedded patterns can be modified through sustained, conscious effort and skillful application of change principles. The ultimate goal of cognitive reprogramming is not to achieve perfect control over mental processes, but to develop greater choice in how you respond to life circumstances. This involves moving from unconscious reactivity to conscious responsiveness. from automatic pattern following to deliberate pattern creation. This transformation requires patience and persistence because changing neural patterns is inherently a gradual process. The brain changes slowly to ensure stability. Rapid mental reprogramming would create psychological chaos and undermine basic functioning. Sustainable change happens through consistent practice over time rather than dramatic, sudden shifts. The practice also requires self-compassion because attempting to change deeply embedded patterns inevitably involves periods of regression, frustration, and apparent failure. These setbacks are normal parts of the change process rather than evidence that reprogramming isn't working. Most importantly, cognitive reprogramming must be guided by wisdom about which patterns serve authentic well-being and which serve only ego gratification or social conditioning. The goal is not to optimize mental functioning for arbitrary purposes, but to align thinking patterns with values, goals, and ways of being that serve genuine human flourishing. When approached skillfully, cognitive reprogramming becomes a powerful tool for psychological liberation, freeing you from unconscious patterns that limit growth while installing conscious patterns that support ongoing development and authentic self-expression. The mind that once seemed like a fixed entity reveals itself as an ongoing creative project that you can consciously participate in shaping. This recognition transforms the relationship between consciousness and conditioning. Instead of being a victim of your programming, you become a conscious programmer. Instead of being controlled by automatic patterns, you become skilled at creating patterns that serve your authentic development and contribute to the well-being of others. At the summit of psychological mastery lies a troubling paradox. The more skillfully we learn to control our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, the more we risk creating subtle forms of self-imprisonment. The very techniques that promise liberation can become new forms of bondage when applied with insufficient wisdom or excessive ambition. Understanding this paradox is crucial for anyone seeking genuine freedom through psychological development. The paradox emerges from a fundamental confusion about the nature of control itself. We typically imagine control as the ability to make things conform to our will, to eliminate unwanted thoughts, produce desired emotions, and guarantee specific outcomes through skillful effort. But this mechanistic understanding of control contains within it the seeds of its own limitations and potential corruption. Consider the practitioner who has mastered emotional regulation to the point where they rarely feel anger, sadness, or fear. On the surface, this appears to be remarkable achievement, freedom from emotional reactivity and the suffering it creates. But closer examination reveals a more complex picture. Has this person achieved genuine emotional freedom, or have they simply become skilled at suppressing, avoiding, or controlling emotional experience? The difference is crucial because true emotional freedom involves the capacity to feel emotions fully when they arise while not being controlled by them. It means being able to experience anger without becoming aggressive, sadness without becoming depressed, fear without becoming paralyzed. Suppressing emotional experience entirely may reduce immediate discomfort, but it also eliminates the valuable information and energy that emotions provide. This distinction points to a deeper paradox. Genuine control often requires a willingness to relinquish control. The person who desperately tries to control their anxiety often increases it through their very efforts. The individual who attempts to force positive thinking often creates internal resistance that generates more negative thoughts. The practitioner who demands emotional equanimity often becomes emotionally rigid rather than genuinely free. The psychological literature on this paradox has identified what researchers call ironic process theory, the tendency for conscious attempts to control mental states to produce the opposite of the intended effect. When we try not to think about white elephants, Our minds become flooded with images of white elephants. When we attempt to force ourselves to sleep, sleep becomes more elusive. When we strain to be spontaneous, spontaneity disappears. This ironic effect occurs because conscious control efforts often activate the very mental processes they're trying to suppress. The monitoring system that checks whether we're successfully avoiding unwanted thoughts keeps those thoughts active in awareness. The effort to force desired states creates tension that interferes with the relaxation necessary for those states to arise naturally. Buddhist psychology has long recognized this paradox through teachings on non-attachment and effortless effort. The enlightened state is described not as perfect control over mental processes, but as natural responsiveness, free from both indulgence and suppression. The skilled meditator doesn't eliminate thoughts and emotions, but learns to relate to them with spacious awareness that neither grasps nor pushes away. Western psychology has arrived at similar insights through research on acceptance-based approaches to mental health. Acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, teaches psychological flexibility, the ability to stay present with difficult experiences while taking values-based action. This approach often proves more effective than traditional control-based strategies for managing anxiety, depression, and other psychological difficulties. The paradox extends beyond emotional regulation into other domains of self-mastery. Perfectionist approaches to habit formation often create rigidity that makes habits fragile and unsustainable. The person who demands perfect adherence to exercise routines often abandons them entirely after missing a few workouts. The individual who creates elaborate systems for productivity optimization often becomes less productive by spending more time managing systems than engaging in meaningful work. This happens because perfectionist control attempts ignore the dynamic, adaptive nature of human psychology. We are not machines that can be programmed once and then run reliably. We are complex adaptive systems that require flexibility, responsiveness, and room for adjustment as circumstances change and understanding evolves. The wisdom traditions have long understood that genuine freedom emerges not from perfect control, but from what might be called skillful relationship with the inevitable changes, challenges, and uncertainties of human existence. This involves developing capacities for wise response rather than mechanisms for rigid control. Skillful relationship begins with accepting what Buddhists call the first arrow, the unavoidable difficulties that are inherent to human existence. Pain, loss, conflict, uncertainty, and death are not problems to be solved through psychological techniques, but realities to be met with wisdom and compassion. The second arrow, our resistance, reactivity, and stories about these inevitable experiences creates most of our actual suffering. This recognition leads to a more sophisticated understanding of psychological mastery. Instead of seeking to eliminate difficult experiences, we develop the capacity to meet them with presence, wisdom, and skillful response. Instead of demanding that life conform to our preferences, we cultivate the flexibility to respond creatively to whatever arises. This shift from control to responsiveness requires what might be called meta skills, capacities that enhance our ability to learn and adapt rather than specific techniques for managing particular situations. These include the capacity for self-reflection, emotional regulation, cognitive flexibility, and what researchers call distress tolerance, to tolerate difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them or compulsively trying to escape them. Developing meta skills involves a different approach to psychological practice. Instead of rigid adherence to specific techniques, it emphasizes experimentation, adaptation, and responsiveness to feedback. Instead of demanding immediate results, it embraces the gradual, non-linear nature of psychological development. Instead of perfectionist standards, it cultivates what might be called good enough mastery, competence that serves authentic well-being without becoming obsessive or self-defeating. The paradox of freedom also reveals itself in the relationship between self-improvement and self-acceptance. Many approaches to psychological development are based on the implicit assumption that who you are now is insufficient and must be changed to become acceptable. This creates a subtle form of self-violence that can perpetuate the very problems it's trying to solve. Genuine transformation often requires a foundation of self-acceptance, recognizing that you are already fundamentally whole and worthy of love, regardless of whatever changes you might choose to make. This doesn't mean becoming complacent or abandoning growth, but rather approaching development from a place of love rather than inadequacy. From this foundation, psychological practices become expressions of self-care rather than self-improvement projects. Meditation becomes a way of offering yourself the gift of presence rather than a technique for achieving particular states. Exercise becomes a celebration of your body's capacity rather than punishment for its imperfections. Emotional work becomes an act of compassion toward your own suffering rather than an attempt to eliminate all negative feelings. The ultimate resolution of the freedom paradox involves recognizing that genuine freedom is not about achieving perfect control, but about developing the capacity for authentic response to whatever life presents. This includes the freedom to feel emotions fully, to make mistakes and learn from them, to be imperfect and still worthy of love, to change and grow while also accepting what cannot be changed. This understanding transforms the relationship between effort and ease in psychological practice. Instead of forcing development through willpower and discipline alone, we learn to work with natural principles of growth and change. We discover that sustainable transformation happens through consistent, gentle practice rather than dramatic efforts that create internal resistance. The paradox of freedom ultimately points toward what might be called effortless mastery, competence that arises naturally from deep understanding rather than forced control. This mastery is characterized by responsiveness rather than reactivity, flexibility rather than rigidity, and wisdom rather than technique. Achieving this level of mastery requires transcending the very desire for mastery itself. When we can engage in psychological practices without attachment to specific outcomes, those practices become more effective. When we can work with our minds without demanding that they behave in particular ways, they often naturally move toward greater balance and wisdom. This is the ultimate paradox. The freedom we seek through control can only be found by learning to let go of control itself, not abandoning all effort or discipline, but holding our efforts lightly and remaining open to outcomes that might be different from what we initially imagined or desired. In this letting go, we discover that true freedom was always already present, not as something to be achieved, but as our natural state. When we stop fighting against the natural flow of experience itself. In the deepest recesses of consciousness lies a capacity that distinguishes human awareness from all other known forms of intelligence, the ability to observe our own mental processes. This metacognitive awareness, consciousness of consciousness itself, represents the ultimate frontier of psychological mastery. When we learn to consistently access and cultivate this observing capacity, we transcend the reactive patterns that bind most human experience and enter into genuine freedom. The observer is not a thing, but a perspective, a quality of awareness that can witness thoughts, emotions, sensations, and experiences without being identified with or controlled by them. It's the part of you that notices when you're lost in thought, that recognizes when emotions are arising, that can step back from intense experiences and observe them with a degree of spaciousness and clarity. Most people have glimpsed this observing awareness in moments of crisis, beauty, or deep contemplation. Time seems to slow down, ordinary concerns fade into the background, and there's a quality of presence that feels both intimate and vast. In these moments, you're not thinking about your experience. You're directly aware of it from a perspective that transcends the usual subject-object duality of ordinary consciousness. This observing capacity exists in everyone, but typically remains undeveloped and rarely accessed. Instead, we spend most of our time identified with the contents of consciousness, the thoughts, emotions, sensations, and stories that flow through awareness. We become so absorbed in the movie of experience that we forget we are also the screen on which the movie is playing. The development of stable observing awareness represents a fundamental shift in the structure of consciousness itself. Instead of being the thinker of thoughts, you become aware of thoughts arising and passing away within a larger field of awareness. Instead of being your emotions, you recognize emotions as temporary visitors in the space of consciousness. Instead of being controlled by reactive patterns, you develop the capacity to witness those patterns with sufficient detachment to choose more skillful responses. This shift begins with what contemplative traditions call disidentification, the gradual loosening of automatic identification with mental and emotional states. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or intellectually detached, but rather developing a more spacious relationship with the inevitable fluctuations of human experience. The practice involves learning to use language differently. Instead of saying, "I am angry," you learn to observe, "Anger is arising in awareness." Instead of claiming, "I am anxious," you notice anxious thoughts and sensations are present. This linguistic shift might seem subtle, but it creates psychological space between the observer and the observed, between awareness and its contents. This space is crucial because it's where choice becomes possible. When you're completely identified with anger, the anger controls your behavior. When you can observe anger arising within awareness, you gain the capacity to choose how to respond to that anger. The emotion is still present and can still inform your actions, but it no longer controls them automatically. Developing stable observing awareness requires consistent practice because identification with mental and emotional states is deeply habitual. The mind has been conditioned since childhood to constantly narrate experience, to create stories about what things mean, to generate emotional reactions to circumstances. These patterns operate so automatically that we rarely notice them, much less question their necessity. Meditation represents perhaps the most systematic approach to cultivating observing awareness. Through practices like mindfulness of breathing, body awareness, or open monitoring, practitioners learn to maintain attention on present moment experience while observing the mind's tendency to wander, elaborate, and react. Over time, this develops the capacity to remain aware of awareness itself, even as various mental and emotional phenomena arise and pass away. But meditation is not the only path to developing observing awareness. Any activity performed with full presence and attention can serve this function. Walking meditation, mindful eating, conscious breathing, or even simple daily activities performed with complete attention can cultivate the same capacity for witnessing consciousness. The key is learning to maintain what researchers call meta-attention, attention to attention itself. This involves developing sensitivity to the quality and focus of your awareness moment by moment. When attention becomes scattered, you notice the scattering. When the mind becomes reactive, you observe the reactivity. When emotions arise, you witness their emergence, presence, and dissolution. This meta-attention gradually reveals the impermanent nature of all mental and emotional phenomena. Thoughts arise and pass away. Emotions emerge and dissolve. Even the strongest psychological states are temporary visitors rather than permanent residents. This recognition naturally reduces the intensity of difficult experiences and the attachment to pleasant ones. The observer perspective also reveals the constructed nature of much of what we take to be reality. From ordinary consciousness, our interpretations of events seem like objective facts. From observing awareness, these interpretations are revealed as stories created by mind, useful sometimes, but not necessarily true or permanent. For example, the thought, "I'm not good enough," might feel like an accurate description of reality when you're identified with it. From observing awareness, you can see this thought as a mental phenomenon that arises under certain conditions, persists for a while, and then dissolves. This doesn't make the thought irrelevant, but it does reduce its power to control your emotional state and behavior. As observing awareness stabilizes, it begins to transform the entire relationship between consciousness and experience. Instead of consciousness being filled with experience, experience is recognized as arising within consciousness. Instead of awareness being shaped by its contents, contents are seen as temporary modifications of awareness itself. This shift has profound implications for psychological freedom. When you no longer identify completely with thoughts and emotions, they lose much of their compulsive power. When you recognize the impermanent nature of all mental states, you develop greater equanimity in the face of both pleasant and unpleasant experiences. When you understand the constructed nature of your stories about reality, you gain greater flexibility in how you interpret and respond to circumstances. The ultimate recognition of observing awareness is what contemplative traditions call non-dual awareness, the direct recognition that the observer and the observed are not actually separate but different aspects of one unified field of consciousness. At this level, there's no longer a sense of someone watching something else, but rather an immediate, intimate awareness of experience as it unfolds. This non-dual recognition doesn't eliminate the practical utility of the observer perspective, but contextualizes it within a larger understanding of consciousness itself. The capacity to step back and observe remains available when needed, but it's no longer based on the illusion that there's a separate self that can control experience from outside it. From this perspective, psychological mastery is revealed not as the ability to control mental and emotional processes, but as the recognition that you are the awareness within which all processes arise. This awareness is naturally free, not because it controls its contents, but because it's not limited by or identified with those contents. This recognition brings a profound relaxation because you no longer need to manage your experience to be free. Freedom is recognized as your natural state rather than something to be achieved through effort. This doesn't eliminate the value of psychological practices, but transforms their purpose from seeking freedom to expressing the freedom that's already present. The awakening of the observer represents the culmination of psychological development, while simultaneously revealing that development to be unnecessary for freedom itself. This paradox points toward the deepest teachings of consciousness. What we seek through practice and effort is already present as the very awareness that seeks. This understanding transforms suffering from a problem to be solved into a temporary modification of consciousness that can be met with presence and compassion. It transforms psychological challenges from obstacles to overcome into opportunities for deeper recognition of the awareness that remains untouched by any particular mental or emotional state. The observer awakens not through becoming something new, but through recognizing what has always been present. This recognition is available in any moment, regardless of what thoughts, emotions, or circumstances might be present. It requires no special conditions, no particular states, no advanced practices, only the willingness to notice the awareness that is already noticing everything else. In this awakening, the entire project of psychological mastery is both fulfilled and transcended. Fulfilled because genuine freedom is recognized and embodied. Transcended because that freedom is revealed to be the natural state of consciousness itself, rather than an achievement of the separate self that seem to seek it. The observer that awakens discovers itself to be not a thing that observes, but the very capacity for experience itself, timeless, limitless, and inherently free. From this recognition, all psychological practices become expressions of freedom rather than methods for attaining it, and life itself becomes the spontaneous play of consciousness, recognizing its own nature. At the summit of psychological understanding lies a revelation that transforms everything we thought we knew about control. There is no such thing as one-way influence. Every act of control creates its own resistance. Every manipulation generates its own countermeasures, and every system of power contains within itself the seeds of its own transformation. To truly master psychology is to understand that controller and controlled exist within a single dynamic system where influence flows in all directions simultaneously. This systemic perspective emerges from complexity science, which reveals that human societies operate as self-organizing networks rather than hierarchical machines. In these networks, information, influence, and power flow according to principles that no single actor can fully control. The CEO who believes they control their company discovers that employee morale, market forces, and cultural currents shape corporate reality as much as executive decisions. The political leader who imagines they direct social change finds that public opinion, technological shifts, and historical momentum determine outcomes more than policy pronouncements. The illusion of unidirectional control persists because we typically observe these systems from within them, focusing on immediate cause and effect relationships while missing the larger patterns that emerge from countless interconnected influences. A dictator may appear to control a population through force and propaganda, but closer examination reveals that their power depends entirely on the consent, compliance, and participation of those they seem to dominate. The moment that consent is withdrawn, through revolution, passive resistance, or simple non-cooperation, the entire system of control collapses. This interdependence becomes visible when we examine what systems theorists call feedback loops, the mechanisms through which outputs of a system become inputs that influence future behaviors. In psychological terms, every attempt to influence others creates responses that influence the influencer in return. The parent who uses fear to control children may achieve immediate compliance, but they also shape their children's future relationship with authority, which will eventually influence how those children treat their own parents as the parents age and become dependent. The teacher who inspires students through authentic passion for learning creates feedback loops of curiosity and engagement that energize the teacher's own development. The leader who leads through service and empowerment receives feedback in the form of follower loyalty and creative contribution that enhances the leader's effectiveness. The manipulator who controls through deception and exploitation generates feedback in the form of mistrust and resistance that ultimately undermines their ability to influence anyone. Understanding these feedback dynamics reveals why sustainable influence must serve mutual benefit rather than unilateral advantage. Systems naturally evolve towards states that serve the well-being of all participants, and they naturally resist configurations that benefit some participants at the expense of others. This isn't moral idealism, but practical systems dynamics. Exploitative relationships create instability that eventually leads to systemic breakdown. The most sophisticated practitioners of influence understand this principle intuitively. They recognize that their own well-being is intimately connected to the well-being of those they seek to influence. They invest in relationships, develop trust, and create value for others, not from altruistic motives alone, but from practical understanding that sustainable influence requires sustainable relationships. This systemic perspective also explains why consciousness and awareness naturally spread through social networks. When individuals develop greater psychological sophistication,